Hello, my dear friends. They called it elegance, but it smelled of rot. Beneath the lace and perfume of the Victorian age lay bodies quietly falling apart, women who starved, suffocated, and poisoned themselves to appear pure, skin burned beneath corsets, lungs filled with fragrance, and hunger was mistaken for virtue. No one spoke of the decay behind the beauty. Tonight, you'll walk their streets, breathe their air, and uncover the secrets that made refinement the most dangerous disease of all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step inside a Victorian bedroom on an ordinary morning, the air would not smell of soap or steam, but of powder and stale fabric. The basin on the wooden stand might hold a thin layer of water left from days before, cloudy with dust and bits of linen. On the dressing table, folded cloths lay neatly beside bottles of perfume and small pots of powder. To a visitor, it looked like a room of refinement and care. Yet the truth hidden within that order was discomfort, infection, and skin that never truly felt clean. The women who lived in such rooms did not bathe often. Instead, they relied on dry cloths to wipe away what they believed was only surface dirt. In doing so, they rubbed the same bacteria back into their pores, pressing filth deeper with every stroke. It is almost absurd that wiping the body with a dry rag was once considered a symbol of gentility. Water, especially cold water, was thought to be dangerous to health. Warm baths were a luxury for the rich and a risk for the delicate. Many feared that soaking the skin might weaken the nerves or cause fainting, so they avoided immersion entirely, using instead a dry wash, in which a soft towel or flannel cloth was rubbed briskly over the skin to restore what they called freshness. The result was the opposite: sweat, oil, and dust mixed, forming a thin, invisible crust that trapped bacteria. When the skin itched, they scratched lightly with their nails, breaking the surface and letting infection grow. Behind closed doors, rashes bloomed under corsets and along the edges of gloves. The clothing itself made matters worse. Layers of heavy fabric clung to damp skin, and the air beneath stayed warm and still. Without bathing, the smallest cut could turn red and swollen. When irritation appeared, women dabbed powder over it to keep it hidden. The powder, made from lead or chalk, dried the surface but locked the problem underneath. If we compare this to today, it would be like trying to heal a wound by sprinkling makeup over it and pretending it was never there. The skin had no chance to breathe. Beneath the white surface of powder and silk, entire colonies of bacteria thrived. Doctors of the time often blamed such skin troubles on poor circulation or emotional instability. They prescribed vinegar rubs, cold compresses, or long rest indoors. What they never considered was that their patients' habits, this constant avoidance of true cleanliness, were the source of the suffering. A woman's body could not speak for itself, so it broke out in rashes and sores. When the discomfort grew unbearable, some blamed spirits, others blamed nerves. To show irritation of the skin was to confess weakness, and Victorian women were trained from birth to conceal weakness at any cost. Those who could afford servants relied on them to manage the washing, yet the servants, too, were bound by the same beliefs. They scrubbed linens but not bodies, changed sheets but not habits. Basins were emptied, cloths hung to dry, and the illusion of hygiene continued. In grand houses, the bathrooms themselves were showpieces rarely used, places for visitors to admire rather than spaces for actual bathing. For most women, the act of cleanliness stopped at the surface. The body became an object of display, painted and powdered, but never truly cared for. The poor, living in narrow rooms with no plumbing, did even less. They washed their hands and faces from shared buckets, saving water for cooking or tea. Bathing was impossible when warmth itself was scarce. Skin diseases spread quickly through crowded districts. Flaking rashes, ulcers, and infections of the scalp or underarms were so common that few even regarded them as illnesses. They were simply part of life. In photographs, the pale complexions of Victorian women hide what their sleeves and collars covered: blotched arms, raw skin, and patches of peeling flesh. There is something deeply disturbing in realizing how beauty could coexist so easily with decay. When irritation turned severe, women sought help from chemists who sold powders, ointments, and mysterious solutions. Many of these contained mercury or ammonia, which burned the surface clean but poisoned the blood beneath. The relief was temporary, the pain enduring, yet they continued to trust the jars and bottles that promised elegance. To be pale was to be admired, and pale skin demanded the sacrifice of health. Those who could not afford medicine used household remedies, vinegar diluted with rose water, flour paste, or cold tea. Some rubbed alum stone over open skin, convinced that the sting meant it was working. It did nothing but worsen the wounds. Inside the parlours of polite society, conversations about hygiene were rare. Illness was a private matter, best hidden behind lace gloves and long sleeves. The sound of scratching under fabric, the faint smell of irritated skin. These things were noticed but never mentioned. Only when a woman's face swelled or reddened beyond concealment did whispers begin. Some were pitied, others quietly mocked for not knowing how to care for themselves. Yet all followed the same misguided routine. To wash daily was seen as coarse, a habit of the labouring classes. True refinement, they believed, was to remain untouched by water. As days passed, layers of powder built upon old layers, mixing with oil and sweat. The face that looked smooth under candlelight was, in truth, a mask of dust and decay. Beneath it, the skin suffocated. Women scratched at their necks in secret, feeling the burn of infection spread like a rash of shame. It is easy now to imagine their discomfort, but for them, this was normal. They believed that appearances defined virtue, and cleanliness was measured not by scent or softness, but by the absence of visible dirt. Their reflection in the mirror offered reassurance that the illusion was intact. The cycle of irritation, concealment, and denial continued through the years. Doctors kept prescribing tonics, chemists kept selling powders, and women kept suffering in silence. The empire admired its elegance while its citizens carried the marks of neglect on their very skin. What passed for hygiene was merely ritual. To touch water was to risk impropriety. To sweat was to admit mortality. The result was a nation of clean dresses and unclean bodies, polished exteriors hiding festering realities beneath. The story of these women's skin tells more than the story of vanity. It reveals a society built on fear of nature itself. They feared their own bodies, their own odours, their own reflection without powder. Cleanliness was no longer about health, but about denial. In their quest to seem pure, they became the opposite. The bodies of Victorian women became silent witnesses to their own misunderstanding, marked by redness, sores, and the faint scent of decay beneath perfume. The tragedy is not in ignorance alone, but in the pride that sustained it. The illusion of refinement came at the price of infection, and that illusion lasted for decades. Some found temporary comfort in perfume and powder, but beneath it all, the body kept decaying quietly. Another layer of cloth or scent could not stop what was happening beneath the skin. The illusion of purity always carried a cost. The more they polished their image, the more their health declined. Beneath the fragrance and lace, infection waited patiently for its turn to rise. The same desire for appearance that destroyed their skin would, in time, rot something else entirely. The air around them, once filled with perfume and powder, would soon be heavy with another smell, one that no scent could hide. The smell of a Victorian woman's body did not drift from soap or lavender, but from sweat trapped under layers of silk, linen, and wool. Each morning began with the tightening of corsets, the pulling of petticoats, and the closing of heavy skirts that sealed the body like a chamber. Beneath all that fabric, warmth gathered and moisture stayed. Hours passed before the scent grew noticeable, but by then it was too late. The odour clung to the air, rising with each movement, settling into the furniture, the curtains, and the very walls of the room. It is rather ironic that an era obsessed with decorum became famous for the very smell it tried hardest to conceal. The problem was not only the absence of bathing, but the weight of the clothing itself. Layers were a mark of respectability, and to wear fewer was indecent. Each layer absorbed perspiration, holding it like a memory of the body. The dampness never fully dried. When the garments were removed at night, they gave off a faint sourness that filled the room, a reminder of how little air the skin had touched all day. Some women placed sachets of herbs between their breasts or under their arms, believing the scent of rosemary or rose petals would hide what they could not wash away. It worked for a few hours. Then the herbs turned musty, and the mixture of perfume and decay became unbearable. The fashion of the time made escape impossible. Corsets pressed the torso tightly, preventing air from reaching the skin. Sweat gathered in the hollows of the back and under the ribs, soaking the linen shifts beneath. Once trapped, the odour could not be released, and so it grew stronger. Even the richest women could not avoid it. In drawing rooms filled with velvet chairs and warm fires, the air became thick with perfume and perspiration. The more they tried to mask it, the worse it became. If we compare it to today, it would be like spraying an entire bottle of perfume into a gym bag that hasn't been washed in weeks. Perfume was not just a luxury, it was a weapon against humiliation. Bottles of musk, civet, and violet oil stood proudly on dressing tables. Women dabbed the strong scents onto their necks, wrists, and even inside gloves. But these perfumes were made from animal glands and heavy oils, their sweetness overwhelming in close spaces. Servants, who worked closest to their mistresses, often struggled to breathe in rooms where the air itself seemed coated with fragrance. Yet they dared not open a window. Fresh air was thought to bring illness, so the stench remained locked inside. At social gatherings, the problem took on another dimension. In crowded ballrooms, the heat of bodies mixed with candle smoke and damp fabric. The air shimmered with a haze of sweat and perfume. Gentlemen smiled politely, but many avoided dancing too closely. Behind fans and gloved hands, whispers spread about which lady smelled faintly of the stables or sweet as the chemist's shop. These phrases circulated quietly but could destroy reputations. A woman's scent, once associated with purity, became a measure of her control, or lack of it. The servants, who washed the clothes and scrubbed the linens, knew the truth better than anyone. They were the ones who lifted the damp dresses from the floor, who emptied basins filled with grey water, who aired the rooms after long nights. They noticed the smell long before their employers did. Gossip travelled through corridors and kitchens, and soon even the coachmen joked about the perfumed fog that followed their mistresses. It is unsettling to realise how easily elegance could become ridicule through something as human as sweat. Men were not immune, but women carried the heavier burden. The social expectation to appear spotless left them trapped in contradiction. They were forbidden to sweat, yet forced to wear layers that guaranteed it. They were told to smell sweet, yet denied the means to stay clean. Many developed rashes from the perfumes themselves. Alcohol-based scents irritated their already inflamed skin, leaving behind red patches that they then covered with powder. The cycle of discomfort continued quietly beneath the surface of polite society. The fear of odour extended to the home. Bedrooms were fumigated with burning herbs, hallways lined with bowls of vinegar, and handkerchiefs soaked in perfume were pressed to the nose when guests arrived. Candles made from tallow added their own sour smell, mixing with everything else until no one could tell where one scent ended and another began. Those who visited often left with headaches or nausea, though it was considered rude to admit it. The polite thing was to smile, compliment the house, and never mention the suffocating air that clung to one's clothes afterward. The medical world offered little comfort. Doctors suggested that women avoid strenuous activity, believing that sweat was a symptom of hysteria or weakness. Exercise was discouraged, which only made the problem worse. Without movement or fresh air, the body's natural cleansing process was stifled. Some doctors prescribed stronger perfumes as a cure for feminine odours, not realising they were only feeding the illusion of cleanliness. In portraits and illustrations, Victorian women appear graceful and serene, their lace collars immaculate, their faces calm. But the artist did not capture the reality that lingered just beyond sight. The air in those rooms was heavy with human scent, layered with chemicals and musk. The perfume bottles glittered, but the truth they hid was far less refined. Every breath carried the faint trace of the body beneath the gown, a reminder that the human form could not be disguised forever. By the end of the century, writers and social commentators began to speak cautiously about hygiene. Cleanliness, they said, was next to godliness. But their advice rarely reached the poorest families. Soap remained expensive, water scarce, and superstition strong. The wealthy, meanwhile, continued to rely on fragrance rather than cleanliness, clinging to their traditions even as they coughed and fanned themselves in scented rooms. What had begun as elegance had become a form of quiet suffocation. The story of Victorian odour is not one of ignorance alone, but of pride and denial. They believed that appearance could erase what the body revealed. They built an empire on discipline and restraint, yet could not control the simplest of human needs. Beneath the lace and propriety, nature always won. The air around them, once filled with perfume and politeness, became an invisible wall between people. Friendships faded, conversations shortened, and entire rooms seemed to hold their breath. The body's scent became a mark of social worth, dividing the refined from the rejected. The obsession with concealment left them isolated, trapped behind fragrance and fear. They masked their discomfort so carefully that they forgot what true cleanliness felt like. In the end, even the strongest perfume could not disguise the truth that lingered beneath every gown and glove. The women who lived inside that suffocating world would eventually learn that scent could ruin more than reputation. It could turn the human body itself into an object of decay. What began as an attempt to appear pure would soon corrupt the very flesh it tried to hide. Inside many Victorian homes, the idea of cleanliness began and ended with appearances. Fresh linens might be folded neatly in a drawer, towels draped carefully across a rack, and corsets hung to air by the fire. Yet the objects that touched the body most closely, the towels, the cloths, the undergarments, were seldom truly clean. Families shared them without question, mothers passing towels to daughters, sisters sharing cloths after use, and servants reusing the same basin water for every member of the household. The result was a quiet spread of infection that no one wanted to acknowledge. It is almost darkly amusing that the people who feared dirt most were surrounded by it every day, hidden in the fabric they trusted most. Bathing itself was a rare event, and so the towels used afterward carried more than just water. They collected flakes of skin, oil, and sweat, becoming soft carriers of bacteria. Once dried, these marks were invisible, so the towel appeared clean again. It would be folded neatly and set aside, waiting for the next person to use it. To wash such cloths properly required boiling water and soap, luxuries for many families who had neither the means nor the time. Instead, they were rinsed in cool water and hung in the same rooms where dust from the streets settled daily. The situation was no better among the wealthy. Servants were tasked with washing intimate garments, but water was reused until it turned grey, and soap was rationed. Some households prided themselves on frugality, considering excess washing a wasteful habit. Corset liners and chemises, soaked with sweat from long days under heavy clothing, were often dried and worn again. Beneath the polished image of refinement, infection festered quietly. The corset itself was a trap for the skin. Made of whalebone, canvas, and silk, it trapped moisture close to the body. Its inner lining, pressed firmly against the flesh, absorbed everything the skin released. When not washed correctly, this lining becomes a breeding ground for fungi. Red patches formed under the ribs and around the waist, itching at first, then burning. Women scratched until the skin broke, leaving raw spots that never fully healed. Yet to remove the corset was unthinkable. Without it, a woman risked losing her shape and, with it, her respectability. If we compare this to today, it would be like wearing the same tight sportswear for weeks and convincing oneself it still smells fresh. Personal hygiene items were treated as reusable property rather than disposable necessities. Sanitary cloths, meant for monthly use, were washed in cold water, wrung out by hand, and left to dry indoors where sunlight could not reach. Moisture clung to them long after, allowing mold and bacteria to thrive. When reused, these cloths caused irritation, itching, and infections that lasted for months. Doctors of the time had little understanding of such problems. Women were told to endure the discomfort as a sign of delicate health or nervous temperament. The real cause, filth and poor hygiene, was rarely discussed. Among the lower classes, things were worse. Shared towels in boarding houses or crowded tenements passed infection from one woman to another. Scabies, fungal infections, and boils became common, spreading silently through families. The embarrassment surrounding personal hygiene meant few sought help. They whispered about discomfort but avoided the doctor, afraid of judgment. It was easier to believe the pain was caused by weakness than by the habits of everyday life. Servants, too, were victims of the same neglect. They washed their mistresses' garments in the same basins used for household linens. No one questioned it. The towels that dried hands were also wiped down tables, and the same rags that cleaned furniture might later be rinsed and used again for personal care. The notion of cross-contamination did not yet exist. What mattered was thrift, not safety. It is disturbing to think how something as innocent as a shared towel could become a silent weapon of disease. In the market stalls, vendors sold second-hand garments without washing them. Women of modest means bought corsets and chemises that had belonged to others, believing that a quick airing by the fire would remove any impurity. Instead, they brought home fabric still carrying traces of the last wearer's skin. The contact between old and new owners continued a cycle of infection that no one could see, but everyone could smell or feel in time. It was a slow, invisible decay, masked by perfume and propriety. Doctors eventually began to notice patterns: rashes that returned after treatment, infections that spread within families, wounds that refused to heal. They prescribed ointments of mercury or arsenic, believing the problem came from within rather than from the very cloth that touched the patient's body. Women obediently applied these remedies, worsening their condition without realizing it. The failure to connect hygiene with health allowed these silent epidemics to continue. In many homes, the faint sour smell of damp fabric lingered permanently. Women grew used to the irritation, the itching that never went away, the dull ache beneath the corset. It became another quiet burden of daily life, one more discomfort to be endured in silence. When infection became too painful, they dusted powder over the sores, adjusted their clothing, and went on as if nothing were wrong. Decay became invisible beneath layers of respectability. This strange mixture of denial and endurance defined Victorian hygiene. To admit infection was to admit uncleanliness, and uncleanliness was moral failure. Better to hide the symptoms and continue pretending that one's home and body were pure. The towels would be folded again, The corsets tightened, and the same rituals repeated endlessly. Cleanliness, in the Victorian mind, was not about removing dirt but about maintaining the appearance of control. Over time, even the smallest acts of sharing, a towel, a basin, a cloth, carried invisible consequences. The very items meant to preserve decency became conduits of disease. Beneath all the lace and polish, bacteria ruled quietly, unchallenged by the people who feared impurity the most. The illusion of order kept the cycle turning, and those who suffered learned to endure in silence. What began as convenience and thrift became a habit of slow self-destruction. The body's protests were dismissed, and infection became as ordinary as breath itself. Cleanliness without cleansing could not last forever. The same hands that shared towels would soon share something worse, an unseen contamination that spread through the air they breathed and the homes they kept. It was only a matter of time before the stench of infection gave way to something even more unbearable. The quiet madness of Victorian women did not begin with sudden screams or delusions, but with the steady torment of their own skin. The itch started as a faint irritation beneath the layers of fabric, an invisible restlessness that grew stronger each day. Nights offered no peace. The body crawled with a feeling that something was alive beneath it, something unclean and unending. Many lay awake in their beds, scratching in silence, careful not to wake the household. In the stillness of candlelight, they rubbed their arms raw, desperate for relief that never came. It is strangely tragic that an empire so proud of its morals was undone by the discomfort of its own undergarments. For these women, cleanliness had become a mental burden as much as a physical one. The belief that purity equaled virtue turned every sensation of dirt into guilt. When the skin burned or itched, they blamed their weakness rather than their habits. They felt haunted by their own bodies, ashamed of what they could not control. Doctors called it hysteria, a word that excused every symptom without ever addressing its cause. Women who could no longer sleep or eat were sent to rest cures in quiet rooms, where they were told to avoid stimulation, bathing, and conversation. Isolation only deepened their despair. The homes that once seemed elegant now become prisons of scent and silence. The smell of old perfume, damp linens, and powder mixed into a constant haze. Windows stayed shut to keep out the air, and fires burned even in spring. Some women grew convinced that unseen forces tormented them. They believed their suffering came from curses, from ghosts, from evil spirits that clung to their flesh. In truth, the torment came from infection, from unwashed skin and reused fabric pressing against open sores. The mind, deprived of rest, began to see what the body could no longer explain. The word unclean carried enormous weight. It was not just a matter of dirt, but of shame. A woman who felt herself unclean feared judgment from others. But more than that, she feared moral decay. Many began to wash compulsively with dry cloths, rubbing their skin until it bled. The friction brought brief relief, then deeper pain. They powdered the wounds, wrapped them again in corsets and linen, and repeated the cycle each morning. The effort to appear perfect left them trapped in an endless ritual of self-destruction. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like using makeup to hide exhaustion while pretending not to feel it, day after day, until the lie becomes indistinguishable from life itself. Husbands, doctors, and servants all misunderstood what they saw. When women cried out from the itching or exhaustion, they were told to control themselves. Emotional restraint was a virtue, and suffering in silence was considered noble. Those who broke under the strain were labelled fragile or unstable. Some were confined to private wards where they were kept under sedation. The rooms were quiet, the sheets clean, but the same neglect persisted. No one washed their skin properly or changed their bandages. Madness was treated with calm surroundings, not with cleanliness. In upper-class circles, stories of women who had lost their minds circulated with morbid fascination. Visitors whispered about the countess who refused to leave her room, because of a smell only she could sense, or the young wife who tore at her clothes in the middle of dinner, certain that insects crawled beneath them. These tales were retold with pity and amusement, as though insanity were an unfortunate flaw of delicate women, rather than the product of years of physical neglect. It is chilling to imagine that the true cause of so much despair was something as ordinary as sweat trapped under silk. The poor suffered differently, but no less intensely. They lacked both medical care and privacy. A mother who spent her days labouring in the factory returned home to find her body covered in sores, her sleep broken by constant itching. Yet she had no time for illness. The same infected towel dried her children's faces and her own. She worked until exhaustion silenced every thought except the next day's survival. In her, the madness took quieter forms: numbness, resignation, a dull acceptance of misery as normal life. As mental strain spread through households, so did superstition. Families began to think the houses themselves were cursed. Candles were lit, prayers whispered, and charms hung over beds. None of these helped. The infections that crept through sheets and corsets did not care for faith or ritual. They thrived in warmth and secrecy, just as the women's thoughts did. The more they tried to hide their shame, the deeper it sank into their minds. Doctors continued to diagnose hysteria, prescribing rest, tonics, or even bleeding. Some recommended marriage as a cure, others cold water poured over the head. They misunderstood everything. The real cause, hygiene and its absence, remained invisible behind the walls of propriety. To speak of itching, of odour, of anything bodily, was to cross a boundary that polite society would not tolerate. And so, the silence grew. Over time, the distinction between physical illness and madness disappeared. Women who could no longer bear the smell of themselves locked their doors and refused visitors. Some stopped speaking altogether. A few took comfort in darkness, believing that without light, they could no longer be seen or judged. To those outside, they seemed possessed or cursed. To themselves, they were simply tired of feeling unclean. The tragedy was not that these women lost their minds, but that society refused to see why. Their despair was painted as weakness, their hygiene as modesty, and their suffering as inevitable. Beneath the surface of elegance and moral virtue lay a deep cruelty, the refusal to care for the body as something real and deserving of kindness. The madness that bloomed from this neglect was quiet, polite, and unseen, just like everything else in the Victorian home. Their homes stood still, filled with faint perfume and unspoken pain. Beneath the gentle flicker of lamps, their minds unravelled slowly, tangled in the same fabric that covered their skin. The cost of being clean, it seemed, was to lose not only the body but the mind as well. The endless pursuit of propriety left them fragile and afraid. They lived surrounded by whispers, perfumes, and ghosts of their own making. In time, the same obsession that destroyed their sanity would begin to corrupt the very clothing that wrapped their suffering so elegantly. The skin of Victorian women bore the cost of beauty and silence. Their faces, painted white with powder, looked calm beneath candlelight, but underneath lay a layer of suffocated pores. Each morning began with the same ritual: a splash of rose water, a pat of powder, and no real washing. They feared that water would strip away what they called the natural bloom, the faint redness that gave the illusion of health, so they kept their faces untouched, believing stillness preserved youth. It is both absurd and tragic that the refusal to wash became a sign of refinement. Without cleansing, oil and dust collected through the day, forming a thin film that no amount of powder could hide. By evening, the face burned with irritation. Underneath the cool white powder, bacteria grew in secret. When the skin broke out, women blamed the weather, the air, or even their emotions. Doctors told them the blemishes came from overactivity of the nerves rather than the dirt pressed into their pores. Those who dared to ask for help were given ointments of lead or mercury. which bleached the skin for a while and poisoned the blood slowly after. The fashion for pale faces only worsened the cycle. Fan Trang, made from lead carbonate, was spread across cheeks and forehead until every natural tone vanished. It clung tightly to sweat, sealing the pores completely. When sweat mixed with powder, it hardened into a crust that cracked with movement. Underneath, the skin struggled to breathe, reddening and swelling as if trying to escape its mask. Yet to leave the house without makeup was unthinkable. A bare face was considered vulgar, a mark of poverty or labour. So women covered their blemishes with more powder, pressing it into infected pores until the irritation spread. Evening brought no relief. The layers of powder and sweat were seldom washed away. Instead, they were brushed off lightly with a cloth and replaced the next morning. The same brushes, never cleaned, carried yesterday's grime into today's routine. The result was a quiet infestation, tiny pimples that turned into abscesses, blackheads that grew into painful boils. If we compare this to today, it would be like sleeping in makeup for weeks and calling it grace. Infections often began small, no more than a red spot on the cheek or chin. But the Victorian habit of touching the face constantly, combined with unwashed hands, turned them deadly. Fingers that had handled coal, candles, or ink pressed dirt directly into open pores. Women, frustrated with imperfections, picked at their skin in front of mirrors. The smallest wound could turn septic. In the absence of proper medicine, many turned to household remedies, vinegar, ashes, or bread poultices, which only inflamed the infection further. A few cases even developed into blood poisoning. Fever followed, then delirium. The link between beauty and death was too easily crossed. The social pressure to appear flawless never eased. Even in sickness, women wore powder to hide their sores. Husbands praised their pale faces without realizing the effort behind them. Servants were ordered to keep mirrors spotless and powder boxes filled. But no one cleaned the sponges or brushes that touched the skin each day. They were used until they turned grey, stiff, and sour-smelling. To discard them was considered wasteful. Thrift was a virtue. Infection was invisible. Poorer women, who could not afford expensive powders, used chalk, flour, or even rice dust to whiten their faces. These rough substitutes clogged the pores just as badly. Their skin, exposed to factory smoke and city soot, erupted in spots that burned and itched. Yet even they envied the ladies who could maintain their pale complexions, unaware that under the polished surface those women suffered the same pain. Beauty, for all classes, had become a slow illness. Doctors began to notice the connection between cosmetic use and facial disease, but their warnings were faint voices against the tide of fashion. Pamphlets circulated about cosmetic poisoning, yet women dismissed them as exaggerations. They trusted advertisements more than physicians. Each jar or box promised purity, youth, and elegance, and those promises outweighed the risk. The pursuit of an unblemished face mattered more than health. As time went on, women's skin lost its resilience. Continuous blockage of the pores caused not only pimples but deep cysts that scarred permanently. The very features they tried to perfect became disfigured. Still, the cycle continued, sustained by vanity and ignorance. Some blamed fate, others the city air. Few admitted the truth that their own rituals were killing their skin. Under the soft glow of lamps, they powdered again before bed, certain that sleep would restore their beauty. Instead, their pores closed tighter with every night. By morning, the mirror reflected a pale mask rather than a living face. The illusion of refinement depended on layers of poison, and no one dared to wash them away. The skin, exhausted and inflamed, mirrored the quiet decay of the era itself. Beauty and sickness became indistinguishable. The smoothness of the surface concealed the rot beneath, just as Victorian society hid its filth under lace and ceremony. To look perfect was to suffer silently. The belief that washing ruined beauty did more than damage the face. It revealed the dangerous power of ignorance disguised as virtue. Those who sought purity through powder learned too late that it brought only infection and scars. Beneath the white mask, their skin pleaded for air that never came. The pursuit of beauty turned their faces into fragile canvases of decay. What once symbolized grace began to crumble under its own weight. In time, the same obsession that ruined their skin would infect something far more intimate, something hidden beneath the layers of silk and secrecy. Victorian women treated undergarments as quiet extensions of modesty, never objects of daily care. They believed that as long as the fabric looked unstained, it was clean. Linen drawers and petticoats were worn for days, sometimes weeks, beneath heavy layers of skirts. The body beneath rarely touched air, and moisture from sweat or urination had nowhere to escape. Dampness turned to irritation, and irritation became infection. Yet few spoke of it. To mention anything about that part of the body was improper, even in sickness. It is grimly humorous that a society obsessed with purity considered washing its most delicate areas indecent. The drawers were usually made from coarse linen or cotton, fabrics chosen for modesty rather than comfort. When washed, it was done hurriedly and without understanding. Women used cold water and harsh lye soap on Sundays, scrubbing by hand until the fibres thinned. The result was a garment that looked clean but still held bacteria deep within its weave. These cloths, stiff and alkaline after drying, rubbed the skin raw. Many women suffered from small cuts and rashes that never healed properly. Still, they put the same fabric on again, believing the pain was simply part of being a woman. In their minds, the absence of visible stains meant all was well. No one thought to question the invisible. Medical understanding of feminine hygiene was nearly non-existent. Advice from doctors rarely extended beyond avoid dampness or keep the body modestly covered. Women were taught that the body's lower half was best left alone, unseen and untouched. As a result, even minor infections grew severe. The combination of moisture, friction, and soap residue created a perfect environment for bacteria and fungi. The ritual of weekly washing turned into an ordeal. On Sundays, garments were gathered into basins of cold water, sometimes shared among multiple family members. Soap was strong, made for scrubbing floors as much as cloth. After washing, the drawers were hung indoors where sunlight could not reach. The air remained heavy and damp, and the garments never fully dried. When worn again, they still carried the faint smell of mildew. This was the scent of normal life, unnoticed by those who lived within it. For poorer women, hygiene was a matter of survival rather than comfort. They owned a few changes of clothing. When one set grew too soiled, they turned it inside out or brushed it with flour to absorb the odour. Those who worked long hours in factories or kitchens spent their days sweating in the same garments they slept in at night. Irritation became part of daily existence, and infection was inevitable. Doctors described female complaints as mysterious disorders, prescribing rest or tonics instead of soap and water. If we compare this to today, it would be like reusing the same unwashed workout clothes for weeks and wondering why the skin refuses to heal. The wealthier classes suffered differently. Their undergarments were finer but layered tightly under corsets and petticoats. Air could not reach the skin, and moisture had no escape. Some women dabbed perfume or powder between their thighs to mask odours, believing fragrance could replace cleanliness. The powders, often made of talc or starch, clumped in the dampness and caused further irritation. When infection spread, they turned to home remedies, vinegar rinses, rose water, or alum powder, each one harsher than the last. Relief was fleeting, and pain became another silent burden hidden behind lace. The servants who washed these garments bore witness to the consequences. They scrubbed linens crusted with discharge, holding them at arm's length to avoid the smell. They never spoke of it aloud, but whispered among themselves about the sores and stains they saw. In private, they shared the same fate. Using the same wash basins and cloths as their employers, they too suffered from infections that no one dared to name. The difference was that they had no powders or perfumes to hide it. In many households, even drying the body after washing was done incorrectly. Towels were rough and reused, spreading bacteria from one area to another. Few understood that moisture left on the skin could cause harm. Some women patted themselves dry with the edge of their chemise or a handkerchief, then dressed quickly before the cold air touched them. The idea of dedicating a clean towel to intimate care was unheard of. Such attention to that part of the body was considered shameful. The result was a constant cycle of irritation and neglect. The discomfort was physical, but its root was cultural. Victorian women were trapped between modesty and ignorance. They were told to remain spotless, but forbidden to learn how. Mothers rarely taught daughters about hygiene, and the subject was excluded from education. Silence was inherited like an heirloom. By the time a woman realized her suffering was not normal, it was too late. The infection had become chronic, the pain an unspoken part of existence. It is deeply unsettling to think that their silence, mistaken for virtue, was in truth a quiet surrender to disease. When illness finally forced them to seek medical help, treatment was primitive. Doctors applied harsh antiseptics or prescribed purgatives, believing that internal cleansing would cure external pain. Some women were told their infections came from immorality or imagination. The stigma drove many to hide their symptoms until they could no longer walk without pain. Their husbands avoided them, their servants pitied them, and society continued to praise their modesty. Within the dimly lit bedrooms of Victorian homes, the air smelled faintly of starch, perfume, and something else, something human and sour. It was the scent of bodies wrapped too tightly for too long. The garments that should have offered protection had become the cause of quiet suffering. Yet for those women, cleanliness was a matter of reputation, not health. They endured the pain in silence, believing that virtue required endurance. The illusion of purity was stronger than the truth of infection. Beneath the softness of lace and linen, their skin burned. Every motion brought a reminder of what they dared not name. Still, they dressed, smiled, and prayed that no one could smell what they could not wash away. Their silence allowed the infections to fester unseen, turning daily discomfort into lifelong torment. Cleanliness without knowledge had become a curse. The more they feared exposure, the more suffering spread behind closed doors. The mind could only endure so long before the body's pain began to twist into something darker. The boundaries between modesty and madness would blur as unspoken pain began to whisper louder than any prayer. And in those whispers, a different kind of decay would begin to take hold. Victorian women took great pride in their hair, long, heavy, and glossy. It was a symbol of beauty and virtue. But behind the polished braids and careful curls lay a secret of decay. Combs passed from hand to hand within families, never washed, their teeth thick with oil and dust. Each stroke through the hair only spread more filth, pushing it deep into the scalp. The shared brushes rested on wooden dressers, coated with a grey film that no one thought to clean. It is almost comical that an age obsessed with refinement could not imagine washing a comb. The daily ritual of hair care was meant to display grace. Women sat before mirrors each evening while servants brushed their hair 100 times to bring out the shine. The brushing did bring shine, but from grease, not health. The oil that coated their hair came from pomades made of animal fat and perfumed wax. Once applied, it trapped dust and sweat, forming a sticky layer that glued strands together. The same brush spread the mixture evenly, blending perfume with grime. Over time, the scalp beneath suffocated, itching constantly. Shared grooming tools turned the vanity table into a breeding ground. Mothers lent brushes to daughters, sisters to sisters, and even visitors might borrow a comb to tidy their hair. No one questioned the practice. To wash such items was unnecessary and, to some, wasteful. The same logic that kept towels unwashed and corsets unclean governed the care of hair. Dust from coal fires, soot from lamps, and even crumbs from meals lodged themselves between the comb's teeth. When dragged through hair, these particles scraped the scalp, leaving microscopic wounds. Infections began there, hidden under layers of pins and ribbons. Hair oil was meant to make hair manageable, yet it sealed the scalp like wax on stone. It collected more than beauty. It gathered the city itself. Street soot, ash, and body oils combined into a dense residue that clung to each strand. Washing hair was rare and often discouraged. Cold water was said to cause headaches or fainting. Warm water was reserved for the ill, so the oil built up, week after week, until the roots could no longer breathe. Women noticed their hair thinning, but they blamed stress or poor diet. Few imagined that the cause sat on their dressing table in plain sight. The combs themselves told the story, their ivory teeth dulled by residue, the wooden handles sticky to touch. Servants were expected to maintain appearances, but not to question hygiene. They brushed their mistress's hair with tools already used on others, then used the same on their own before bed. Lice, dandruff, and bacteria passed silently from one head to another. It was an invisible intimacy that no one acknowledged. If we compare it to today, it would be like sharing a toothbrush among family members and wondering why everyone keeps getting sick. The scalp responded with quiet rebellion. It flaked, burned, and shed its hair in soft handfuls. Some women woke to find strands scattered on their pillows. Others noticed bare patches near the temples, hidden beneath decorative combs. Barbers and chemists offered solutions, tonics of sulfur, mercury, or lead, each promising to restore youth and volume. These cures only deepened the damage. The scalp, already raw from infection, blistered under the chemicals. The smell of these tonics filled bedrooms with a stench of rot disguised as medicine. In wealthier homes, servants brushed and styled their mistresses' hair for hours. The process looked soothing, but was far from gentle. Pulling and twisting through dirty strands loosened the roots even more. When hair began to fall out, wigs became the silent answer. Made from horsehair or human hair bought from the poor, they covered bald spots and offered a renewed illusion of health. Yet beneath the wigs, the scalp continued to fester. The trapped heat encouraged fungal growth, and the hair beneath withered away entirely. The poor faced their own misery. Without access to oils or wigs, they tied their thinning hair back with rags and hoped no one would notice. Working among smoke and dirt, their hair grew brittle and coarse. They washed it with lye or soap scraps, both too harsh for the skin. The burns and scabs that followed turned to scars, and hair never grew there again. For them, baldness was not vanity's punishment, but poverty's mark, visible proof of the filth that ruled their days. Men suffered too, though they pretended otherwise. Barbers reused brushes and razors on every customer, rarely cleaning them. The same brush that swept dandruff from one head polished another without pause. Scalp infections spread through the city this way, mistaken for ordinary hair loss. Doctors called it ringworm of the scalp, but offered little cure. They prescribed sulfur ointments that smelled worse than the disease itself. The women who lost their hair suffered in silence. In a society that equated beauty with morality, baldness was humiliation. Some hid their heads under bonnets, others pinned false curls to their remaining strands. A few never recovered, both in body and spirit. The constant shedding reminded them daily of the decay they could not control. The vanity that once gave pride now brought shame. What they could not see was that their suffering came from the very objects they trusted, the combs, brushes, and oils that promised beauty. The disease of vanity spread quietly, disguised as care. Cleanliness was sacrificed to custom, and hair, that once symbol of virtue, became proof of neglect. The ritual of brushing, once soothing, had turned into slow self-harm. Each stroke carried more than dirt. It carried the illusion that filth could be refined simply by polish and perfume. Beneath the calm of their reflections, their hairlines receded like the empire's own illusion of perfection. The beauty they fought to preserve had begun to betray them. Their hair fell, their scalps burned, and their mirrors no longer offered comfort. Yet this decay above the face was only a reflection of what spread deeper, in places still hidden by silence and lace. By the time many Victorian women reached their 30s, their once prized hair had begun to thin. The curls that once framed their faces now fell in dull strands, lifeless from years of oil, powder, and neglect. Yet to speak of boldness was unthinkable. Hair was not merely beauty, it was identity, morality, and worth. A woman's reputation could wither faster than her hair if anyone hinted that she was losing it. So they found a way to hide the truth. Wigs of human hair or coarse horsehair became their silent companions. Heavy crowns of deception worn with grace and pain. It is grimly amusing that in a society terrified of indecency, no one saw the cruelty of sewing horsehair into their own skin. Wigs were symbols of wealth and composure, made to mimic natural curls. They were styled elaborately, pinned high, and perfumed with lavender or rose oil. But beneath the glamour lay discomfort that no perfume could conceal. The wigs were hot, stiff, and rough against the scalp. The inner lining was often made from thick fabric or wire mesh that rubbed the skin raw. Sweat gathered underneath, trapped by the layers of powder and pomade. What started as mild itching soon turned into sores. The scalp, already weakened from infection and hair loss, broke down under the constant friction. Some women wore wigs so tightly that the pressure alone caused further damage. The hair that remained was pulled from the roots, leaving patches of bare skin. But removing the wig in public was unacceptable. It was an act of shame, an admission of imperfection. So they endured, smiling through the pain while the heat beneath their crowns grew unbearable. Servants were tasked with maintaining these wigs, combing them, curling them, and dusting them with powder, but never washing them. The build-up of oil and sweat turned the wigs into breeding grounds for lice and infection. Those who could afford better quality wigs sought them from professional wig makers. These artisans sourced hair from barbers, servants, or the poor, buying it by the ounce. Some even imported horsehair, prized for its strength and volume. It was boiled to remove odour, dyed to match fashionable shades of brown or black, and woven into intricate frames. Once worn, however, the horsehair retained its stiffness, pricking the scalp like needles. The illusion of full hair came at the cost of constant irritation. In private, the reality was less elegant. Beneath their wigs, women's scalps festered with sores. They scratched at night, leaving traces of blood on their pillows. Still, they wore their wigs again each morning. To appear in public without them was worse than enduring pain. Mirrors became both comfort and punishment, a reflection of what was lost and what has to be maintained. Husbands often pretended not to notice. To comment on baldness was considered rude, and to acknowledge it was to strip away dignity. Silence was the gentlest cruelty. If we compare this to today, it would be like gluing a heavy plastic mask to one's face every day just to pretend nothing has changed. Doctors offered strange remedies. Some prescribed tonics made from iron and brandy to stimulate hair growth. Others suggested rubbing onion juice or turpentine into the scalp to wake dormant roots. When these failed, women turned to desperate measures. A few commissioned wig makers to stitch the wigs directly onto their heads. The process involved sewing through skin and flesh, anchoring the wig with knots that tore when removed. The pain was excruciating, the wounds slow to heal. But the result, an illusion of natural hair, was worth it to those terrified of ridicule. In upper-class society, gossip about baldness spread quietly. At dinners and dances, Whispers moved from one corner to another about which lady's curls were too perfect, which coiffure never moved in the wind. Everyone knew, yet no one said a word aloud. To discuss such things was indecent. Instead, they smiled politely, inhaling the powder-scented air that surrounded each heavy wig. The dance floor shimmered under candlelight, the air thick with heat and human effort, and beneath it all, dozens of women endured the prickling torment of their false crowns. The wigs themselves aged poorly. With time, the horsehair stiffened and broke. Strands fell like dry grass, leaving gaps that revealed patches of fabric beneath. To hide this, women applied more powder, turning their heads into pale clouds that crumbled with touch. The constant maintenance exhausted them. Some hired hairdressers to adjust the wigs each morning, while others relied on servants who used needles and thread to tighten the fit. Every adjustment brought more pain, yet they accepted it as part of life. Among the poor, baldness carried less shame but more hardship. Without access to wigs, they wrapped their heads in scarves or bonnets, sometimes stuffing fabric inside to mimic volume. The constant friction made matters worse. Hair refused to grow back, and the skin beneath hardened like leather. These women were ridiculed by those above them, not knowing that the wealthy suffered the same affliction, only hidden under silk and horsehair. The obsession with covering baldness revealed the Victorian fear of decay. To lose hair was to lose youth, and to lose youth was to lose value. Every strand that fell seemed a warning that beauty, and therefore worth, was slipping away. Yet in chasing the illusion of vitality, they hastened their decline. Their wigs rotted, their scalps bled, and their dignity depended on something that smelled faintly of death. In portraits, the women appear timeless, their hair gleaming like polished bronze. The paint hides what the era refused to see, the sores, the baldness, the suffering beneath the powder. Behind every perfect coiffure was a head that ached and burned. Beneath every polite smile was the quiet endurance of a body trapped by vanity. The polished curls that graced Victorian portraits were not symbols of beauty, but masks of decay. Beneath them, infection and shame coexisted in silence. The empire prized elegance above truth, and in that pursuit, its women bore the weight of deception both literal and moral. The need to hide their failing hair was only the beginning. Beneath those wigs, something darker grew, an infection that would not stay confined to the scalp but would creep through the body, fed by the same ignorance that made them suffer in silence. In the parlours and dining rooms of Victorian England, conversation was considered an art form. Words floated elegantly through the air, adorned with manners and charm. Yet beneath that veneer of grace, every sentence carried something else, an odour that clung to the breath of nearly everyone in the room. Halitosis was not a flaw, but a fact of life. The faint sweetness of decay hovered between teacups and fans, unspoken and politely ignored. It is oddly ironic that the same society that invented etiquette forgot the most basic courtesy of all: clean breath. To the Victorians, oral hygiene was more ritual than science. Tooth care was a luxury, and brushing was performed only when necessary. Most people owned a single toothbrush, often made of bone with coarse animal bristles, which they used until it frayed into splinters. Toothpaste, when available, came in the form of gritty powders made from crushed charcoal, chalk, or even brick dust. Some versions included soap to create foam, which stung the mouth and left behind a bitter taste. The wealthy prided themselves on using these expensive concoctions once or twice a week, believing that was sufficient. To clean too often, they feared, might weaken the gums. The result was a slow, quiet decay. Bits of meat and bread lodged between teeth, left to rot for days. The mouth became warm and moist, a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. As the gums swelled and bled, the teeth began to loosen. The breath that escaped carried the scent of rot mixed with perfume. Women masked it with mint lozenges or violet candies, while men chewed tobacco or cloves. The air in public gatherings was a strange mixture of sweetness and corruption, like flowers left too long in water. Dentistry existed, but it was brutal. Tooth extraction was common, and prevention was rare. Few visited dentists unless pain became unbearable. Those who could afford it sometimes used ivory or porcelain dentures, but these too collected debris and smelled worse than natural teeth. Cleaning them meant rinsing in cold water or rubbing with a handkerchief, which did little more than move the filth around. Poorer people made do with nothing at all, letting their teeth fall out one by one. Smiling too widely became a mark of vulgarity, not for modesty, but to hide the state of one's mouth. At dinner tables, the odour of unwashed mouths mingled with the rich aroma of roasted meats and wine. Candlelight softened faces but could not disguise the faint sour scent that filled the air when guests leaned close to speak. Fans fluttered discreetly between sentences. Perfume bottles were opened more often, and polite distance became a silent form of defence. Those who dined with the aristocracy often commented privately that the higher the rank, the stronger the stench. Clean breath, like clean water, was something the rich could talk about but rarely possessed. If we compare this to today, it would be like attending a gala where everyone wears designer clothes but refuses to shower. Even the efforts to fix the problem made it worse. Mouthwashes were mixtures of alcohol, vinegar, and herbs that scorched the tongue without killing bacteria. Some added ammonia or carbolic acid, leaving chemical burns along the gums. The sting was considered proof of effectiveness. Women rinsed before social events, swallowing some of the liquid in hopes that freshness would last longer. It never did. Within an hour, the bitterness of decay returned, stronger than before. Servants, tasked with cleaning the family's silverware and glassware, often noticed faint residues of grease and saliva even after washing. They whispered that their employer's cups smelled like death. The gossip travelled through kitchens and corridors, but no one dared speak of it upstairs. The idea that a lady or gentleman might have foul breath was too humiliating to admit, so the silence continued, thick as the air itself. Children grow up imitating their parents' habits. They learn to brush only when reminded or when their mouths hurt. Schools rarely mentioned dental care, and doctors focused on digestion or nerves instead. Toothache was treated with drops of laudanum or brandy. Those who suffered long enough lost not only their teeth, but also their ability to eat properly. Many elderly Victorians lived on soups and puddings, their mouths empty but still unclean. For the poor, the situation bordered on hopeless. They brushed with rags dipped in soot or salt, grinding away at their teeth until the enamel wore thin. Some used ashes from the fireplace as powder, believing it prevented disease. The constant abrasion caused bleeding and sensitivity, but pain was preferable to stench. Street vendors selling cheap tooth powders made from bone dust and chalk thrived on this desperation. They promised a noble smile for a penny, though their powders often did more harm than good. The Victorian mouth, for all its outward propriety, was a quiet ruin. Breath carried the scent of infection, smiles hid decay, and every polite conversation was layered with the aroma of slow rot. Perfume could mask it for a moment, but not forever. Beneath every whispered word and gentle laugh was the reminder that beauty and refinement could not disguise neglect. Dentists and reformers began to raise alarms late in the century. They spoke of tooth decay as a public health issue, linking it to digestive problems and infection, but their words reached few. The wealthy still believed that strong perfume and restraint could solve everything. The poor simply endured. The mouth remained a mirror of the age, beautiful in form, rotten beneath. The silence of the era extended even here. To speak of breath was indecent, to mention decay was rude, and to suggest daily brushing was unnecessary extravagance. The result was a society that smiled with closed lips, whispering politeness through the stench of its own denial. The elegant conversations that filled Victorian rooms were spoken through teeth rotting in slow motion. Breath became another invisible marker of class and ignorance, shared equally by rich and poor. The body, once again, told the truth that manners tried to hide. Their mouths, polished by words and poisoned by neglect, carried the scent of their civilization's contradictions. The decay did not stop with the tongue. It would travel deeper, into the ears, where beauty and disease began to meet in silence. In the drawing rooms of Victorian homes, silence was a rare luxury. Music boxes played softly, fireplaces crackled, and the rustle of silk skirts filled the air. Yet within this world of sound, many women slowly began to lose the ability to hear. It did not happen suddenly. It began with a small itch deep inside the ear, an irritation too private to mention aloud. A hairpin, a wooden stick, or a sewing needle offered quick relief. What followed was infection, pain, and, too often, silence that would last a lifetime. It is disturbingly ironic that women who prized grace above all ended up deaf because they tried to clean too elegantly. Victorians believed that earwax was a sign of poor hygiene, something to be removed at any cost. They had no understanding that it was nature's protection. Advertisements in medical pamphlets promised instant cleanliness, with tools made of ivory or silver, their tips sharp and narrow. Ladies' magazines described the practice as part of grooming, as routine as brushing the hair. Hairpins were the most common instrument, conveniently at hand and thin enough to reach what could not be seen. Servants did the same, copying their mistresses' habits. In the quiet corners of bedrooms, behind mirrors and candles, the ritual was performed with precision and ignorance. The skin inside the ear is delicate, but the Victorians treated it like wood to be scraped. Each insertion left scratches too small to notice at first. Over time, these wounds became tiny doorways for bacteria. Infection settled in quietly, bringing with it the dull throb of pressure and the faint ringing that never went away. Women would touch their ears absent-mindedly during tea or supper, wincing slightly but saying nothing. To complain of such a thing was unladylike. The discomfort was hidden behind smiles, much like everything else in their lives. When the pain deepened, they sought comfort in home remedies. Warm oil, brandy, or vinegar was poured into the ear to draw out the bad humours. Some tied heated salt in a cloth and held it to the side of the head, believing warmth would soothe the ache. It sometimes did, for a moment. Then the pain returned, sharper and deeper. The infection crept inward toward the middle ear, swelling behind the drum until hearing dimmed completely. The world, once full of chatter and clinking glass, faded into a muffled hum. Doctors of the time offered little help. They inspected with small mirrors and candles, peering into ears already raw. The treatments were worse than the disease. Leeching, cauterization, and even puncturing the eardrum were considered acceptable cures. Some women left the doctor's office with cotton plugs soaked in mercury or carbolic acid. The relief was temporary, the damage permanent. If we compare it to today, it would be like stabbing the inside of a smartphone to clean its screen, then wondering why it no longer works. The belief in constant self-maintenance made matters worse. Hygiene had become an obsession, and the ear, like every part of the Victorian body, was treated as something that must be polished rather than protected. Perfumed oils were poured into the canal for fragrance, trapping moisture and feeding bacteria. In wealthy households, personal grooming sets included ear picks shaped like jewellery, the handles engraved with floral designs. These tools were status symbols, not medical instruments. To use them was to prove refinement, even as they caused harm. In the poorer districts, the practice was rougher but no less dangerous. Wooden matchsticks, wire pins, or even sewing needles served the same purpose. Children copied their parents, and entire families developed chronic ear infections. The pain became so familiar that many stopped noticing it. The constant ache behind the jaw blended into the rhythm of daily life, another discomfort to be endured quietly. Some lost their hearing altogether, mistaking the silence that followed as a sign of aging or fate. For the women of the upper class, deafness became both embarrassment and escape. They could no longer follow conversations at crowded dinners or hear gossip whispered behind fans. Some claimed the quiet was peaceful, others retreated entirely from social life. It was easier to pretend to be delicate than to admit they had caused their own condition. Husbands and doctors described their deafness as nervous, another manifestation of female fragility. The truth, that they had injured themselves in pursuit of cleanliness, was too undignified to acknowledge. Servants noticed before anyone else. They watched their mistresses tilt their heads to one side, asking others to repeat themselves. They saw them flinch at sudden noises or fail to respond to whispers. But servants did not speak of it, just as no one spoke of the infections that caused it. Silence became both symptom and defense. The infection that began with a scratch sometimes spread to the bone. Fever followed, bringing delirium. A few women died from what began as an itch, their deaths recorded simply as ear inflammation. The link between vanity and mortality was never made public. In the end, families described these illnesses as mysterious ailments of the head. No one wanted to admit that the cause lay in something so trivial, so domestic. As years passed, the fashion of ear cleaning continued, reinforced by ignorance and pride. Medical reformers warned against it, but their voices were drowned by advertisements promising ears of purity and distinction. Cleanliness had become a kind of faith, and its followers accepted suffering as proof of devotion. The ear, small and unseen, became yet another casualty in the war between appearance and reality. Behind every polite conversation in Victorian parlours was an irony few noticed. The sound of words spoken to people slowly losing their ability to hear them. The same hands that held fans and teacups had also carved pain into their own flesh. In their quest to appear immaculate, they erased one of the senses that connected them to the world. The silence that fell upon them was not peace, but punishment. What began as a small act of vanity became a quiet descent into isolation. And in that silence, other dangers would grow, feeding on the same ignorance that had already stolen their hearing. Among the many rituals that defined Victorian womanhood, few were as quietly dangerous as the pursuit of fragrance. Scent was more than vanity. It was a symbol of purity and self-control. A proper lady was expected to smell delicate, floral, and untouched by sweat or labour. Yet in their determination to preserve this illusion, many women introduced infection into the very parts of their bodies they sought to keep clean. Inside drawers lined with lace and linen sat small pouches of herbs, lavender, rose petals, or camphor, wrapped in cloth and tied with ribbon. They were meant to guard against odour, but they did far more harm than anyone imagined. It is bitterly funny that the very objects meant to preserve their innocence were quietly destroying their health. The practice began innocently enough. Women read in household manuals that herbs could balance the humours and restore natural freshness. The idea spread quickly through drawing rooms and servants' quarters alike. Some women sewed small sachets and placed them beneath their skirts. Others tucked them directly between layers of undergarments. For the upper class, it became an unspoken rule of refinement, a secret known only to women and their maids. In warm weather, the scent was stronger, and so were the consequences. The cloth absorbed sweat, while the herbs, often unwashed and stored in damp jars, bred bacteria within days. Victorian homes were far from sterile. Kitchens, gardens, and bedrooms often shared the same insects and dust. Herbs were gathered from local markets or backyard plots, tied into bunches, and left to dry near fireplaces. Dust settled, mould grew, and no one thought twice. The pouches were reused again and again, their colours fading as the oils within turned rancid. Some women believed that the stronger the smell, the better the effect. They were unaware that the heat and moisture of their bodies created the perfect incubator for infection. Soon came the itching, the swelling, and the quiet misery that could not be discussed. In a society that silenced all talk of the body, these women suffered in secret. Doctors rarely took their complaints seriously, diagnosing vague female disorders or nervous conditions. When infections spread, many women blamed themselves for being unclean, not realizing that the cause lay in the very sachets they trusted. Servants, who copied their mistresses' habits using cheaper materials, fared even worse. Their herbs came from dusty apothecaries, often mixed with mouldy leaves or crushed stems. For them, the line between cleanliness and pain disappeared entirely. Some women replaced herbs with more scientific mixtures sold by chemists. These contained camphor, alum, or even mercury, substances believed to purify the body. They burned the skin, caused sores, and yet were praised for their cooling sensation. The advertisements were persuasive for the gentle freshness of roses. Used daily, the results were tragic. What began as irritation often became a full infection. The constant burning, the hidden pain, was endured silently beneath layers of silk and cotton. If we compare it to today, it would be like spraying disinfectant directly onto one's skin every morning and calling it skincare. The odour that these women feared so desperately was not filth, but nature. Yet the Victorian obsession with restraint left no room for natural processes. Sweat, menstruation, and scent were viewed as moral weaknesses, things to be conquered rather than understood. Mothers taught daughters to never let the body betray itself, passing down recipes for fragrant pouches as if they were sacred heirlooms. The result was generations of women treating infection as refinement, mistaking pain for cleanliness. In some houses, maids were responsible for preparing the sachets. They ground the herbs, stitched the cloth, and placed them carefully in drawers or corsets. Few washed their hands before or after handling them. The same fingers that scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots also tied ribbons for the lady's freshness bag. The irony was cruel. The very symbol of sophistication depended on the labour of those living in dirt. Doctors eventually began to notice patterns. Women who came to clinics with pelvic pain, discharge, or fever often admitted to using herbal pouches. Still, few physicians dared to challenge the practice openly. To accuse women of causing their own infections was considered improper, and to discuss the details of their bodies was unthinkable. Instead, medical journals wrote vaguely of inflammations common among the fair sex. The shame was left unspoken, but it lingered like the very scent they had sought to hide. Among the poorer classes, infection was even more severe. Without access to clean fabric, women reused the same sachets until they disintegrated. Some mixed herbs with animal fat to make them stick longer, unaware that this trapped more moisture. Others placed crushed mint or rosemary leaves directly against the skin, mistaking the burning for cleansing. By the time pain became unbearable, infection had already spread deep within. There were no antibiotics, only poultices and prayer. In portraits and letters, these women appear serene, delicate, untouched by discomfort. Yet behind the lace gloves and corsets were wounds they could never reveal. The infection crept through their lives quietly, as unnoticed as the scent that masked it. Their society demanded perfection, and perfection required silence. They paid the price in private. The herbal sachets, sweetly perfumed and carefully stitched, represented everything Victorian women were told to be modest, fragrant, pure. But inside those pouches, hidden from sight, was decay. The beauty they sought came at the cost of pain they could not name, and the sweet fragrance that clung to their clothes became the perfume of denial. The illusion of purity always demanded a sacrifice. Their bodies bore the cost in secret, while their faces remained calm and composed. Yet this quiet suffering was only one form of harm among many. There were others still, less visible, buried beneath corsets and flowers, waiting to surface in ways that would terrify even those who believed they were safe. In the glittering parlours of Victorian high society, Few women were as admired as the lady whose death would become both a tragedy and a warning whispered behind closed doors. She was known for her grace, her perfect posture, and above all, her scent, a faint sweetness of flowers that lingered long after she passed by. The fragrance came not from perfume bottles, but from a small bouquet she kept tucked beneath her corset, pressed close to her skin. It was her secret, her charm, and eventually her undoing. It is darkly humorous that in a society obsessed with appearances, a woman could literally die from the very flowers that made her beautiful. The custom of carrying flowers near the body was a sign of refinement. In crowded rooms filled with candle smoke, sweat, and stale air, the natural scent of petals was thought to preserve one's purity. Ladies pinned roses between the folds of their dresses or slipped lavender sprigs into their corsets. The warmth of the skin released the fragrance slowly, creating what fashion magazines described as living perfume. But nature, when trapped, begins to decay. The flowers absorbed sweat and heat, darkening as they wilted. Over days, the petals softened into rot, their moisture seeping into the fabric of corsets that were rarely washed. What had begun as beauty soon turned foul. The lady in question, known in her circle for her elegance, was particularly fond of white lilies. Their scent was strong, and she liked how it masked the odour of tight clothing and heavy powder. Her maid would prepare a small bouquet each morning, pressing it gently beneath the stiff stays of her corset. By evening, the flowers were flattened and damp, but she refused to remove them. The fragrance was her armour, her symbol of distinction among women competing for admiration. When she began to complain of pain beneath her ribs, no one dared question her habits. The corset stayed laced, the flowers replaced daily, and the infection grew. At first, it was only a rash. The skin reddened where the damp petals touched. Then the pain deepened, a burning beneath the surface. Still, she smiled for guests, attended dances, and received compliments on her scent. Her maid noticed the spots spreading but said nothing. To speak of her mistress's body was forbidden, and to suggest that the flowers were to blame was unthinkable. Beneath the layers of silk and lace, the skin blistered and broke. The rot of lilies met the warmth of flesh, and what began as perfume turned to poison. Doctors were summoned only when the lady fainted at dinner, her face pale and feverish. They examined her superficially, prescribing tonics and rest. It was only when she could no longer breathe comfortably that they unlaced her corset and discovered the truth. The skin beneath her chest had ulcerated. The infection had spread deep into her tissues. The remnants of petals were still there, blackened and fused to the wound. The smell was unbearable. Her body, once the picture of delicacy, had become the very image of decay. She died within days. Newspapers called it a mysterious fever, and her name was preserved with pity, not scandal. Only those closest to her knew the truth, that vanity had turned fatal. The servants burned her gowns and corsets, unable to cleanse the stench of death from the fabric. Yet among her peers, the practice continued. No one wanted to believe that beauty could kill. Other women merely changed the flowers they used, choosing lavender or violets instead of lilies, as if scent alone were the problem. The incident revealed how little the Victorians understood about hygiene beneath their polished appearances. Corsets were rarely washed, and the padding inside them absorbed years of sweat, powder, and perfume. When combined with rotting organic matter, they became breeding grounds for bacteria. Yet women continued to wear them proudly, convinced that the faintest hint of body odour would ruin their reputation. If we compare this to today, it would be like hiding a rotten fruit inside designer clothing just to smell expensive. For the lower classes, the idea of perfuming the body was an unreachable luxury. They watched from a distance as noble women paraded their fragrant silhouettes, unaware that the very symbols of refinement were turning against them. Gossip spread quietly through servant halls, stories of women fainting, of doctors whispering behind doors, but such tales were dismissed as exaggerations. The upper class could not afford to believe that beauty itself was dangerous. After her death, a few physicians began to speak of corset rot, a term describing the infections caused by trapped moisture and decaying materials. They advised against placing anything organic under clothing, but their warnings went largely ignored. Fashion spoke louder than science, and vanity silenced fear. Women continued to perfume themselves with dried flowers, believing that illness struck only the careless or the poor. The truth was that the disease respected no class. Inside drawing rooms, the scent of lilies became faintly taboo. Some claimed it carried bad luck, others said it reminded them of funerals. Still, corsets remained unchanged, tight, unwashed, and merciless. The lady's death faded from memory. Her name mentioned only in passing as the one who wore flowers too long. The irony lingered long after the tragedy. A symbol of elegance had become an instrument of decay. The corset that once shaped beauty now held death close to the heart, pressing it into the skin. The flowers that had drawn admiration became the silent witnesses of her suffering. Behind every polished surface of Victorian life was a quiet rot, born of denial and pride. The story of the lady and her bouquet was not an exception, but a reflection of her time. Beneath the satin and perfume, the body rebelled against the lies it was forced to wear. The woman's death marked another unspoken truth of her era, that even the most beautiful things, when trapped and suffocated, will begin to decompose. The body, too, was no exception. And within that decay, other horrors would soon bloom, hidden yet waiting to emerge. Victorian beauty began with powder. A pale, flawless complexion was the ultimate mark of refinement, a signal of wealth and delicacy. The rich could afford to stay indoors, untouched by sun or labour, and their faces showed it, white, smooth, and powdered to perfection. But beneath that porcelain surface, skin blistered, lips festered, and ears swelled with infection. The cosmetics that promised beauty were made of poison, and every application brought women closer to ruin. It is tragically absurd that the same powder used to appear angelic was quietly eating away at their flesh. Face powders were mixtures of white lead and mercury, two metals prized for their ability to lighten skin and add a smooth texture. The lead gave the face a ghostly sheen, while mercury added brightness. Women dabbed the powder across cheeks and foreheads, blending it carefully with soft brushes or puffs of silk. It hid redness, freckles, and fatigue, turning skin into something close to marble. But over time, that marble began to crack. The metal seeped through the pores, burning and inflaming the skin beneath. The powder that once covered blemishes soon created them. At first, the symptoms were subtle itching, dryness, a faint rash along the jawline. Then came the scaling, the open sores, the grey pallor that no amount of powder could hide. Some women blamed the air, the diet, or even nerves. None suspected the small ivory box on their dressing table. They continued to use it, day after day, convinced that without it their faces would betray fatigue or sin. The more their skin deteriorated, the thicker the layers they applied. It became a cycle of pain disguised as perfection. Lip colour carried its own dangers, made from animal fat, cinnabar, and sometimes red lead. Early lipsticks were stored in small glass pots that grew rancid within days. The fats turned sour, breeding bacteria, and the lead tainted the skin with invisible corrosion. The colour flaked off with meals, so women reapplied constantly, pressing the mixture against raw lips already irritated by the ingredients. Soon, cracks formed at the corners of their mouths, oozing and stinging. Yet they smiled through it, the bright red gloss masking decay. Jewellery added another layer of harm. Nickel earrings were fashionable and affordable, worn by both wealthy women and maids. but nickel was notorious for causing inflammation. The metal reacted with sweat and skin oils, turning small piercings into infected wounds. Lobes swelled, crusted, and dripped pus. Yet to remove the earrings was to admit something was wrong. So they stayed in place, glinting prettily under candlelight while the flesh beneath them rotted in silence. If we compare this to today, it would be like wearing makeup laced with battery acid and calling it elegance. Those who could afford professional cosmetics bought them from apothecaries. The ingredients were no safer, only more expensive. Some products promised to purify the skin with mercury chloride or restore youthful colour with arsenic water. These toxins entered the bloodstream, causing tremors, dizziness, and in severe cases, madness. Women who had once prided themselves on poise began to shake uncontrollably. Doctors called it hysterical trembling, never linking it to the jars and bottles their patients kept on the vanity. In the privacy of their dressing rooms, the ritual of beautification was both sacred and secret. Mirrors reflected faces that glowed faintly white in the morning light, soft and powdery like porcelain dolls. Beneath the surface, however, cells were dying. The metals built up slowly, turning the blood thick and the skin grey. The women of the upper classes appeared calm and untouched by hardship, but their beauty was borrowed time. Each smile hid the fatigue of a poisoned body. Even the scent of these cosmetics betrayed their danger. The powders carried a metallic tang, the creams a sourness that no rose oil could mask. Maids tasked with cleaning the vanity tables often felt dizzy from the fumes. They wiped spills of mercury-based lotion with bare hands, unaware that each touch absorbed a trace of toxin. Over time, both mistresses and servants shared the same symptoms: pale faces, trembling fingers, dull eyes. Society, however, praised the look. Pale skin was purity, red lips were vitality, and a shimmering sheen meant wealth. To appear natural was to appear poor. Women competed silently for the whitest complexion, whispering about secret recipes or imported creams. They ignored the sores and the fevers that came with their beauty, because to be flawless mattered more than to be well. A few reformers spoke out against the use of poisonous cosmetics. They published articles and pamphlets warning of face rot and lead sickness. But such warnings were dismissed as hysteria. Manufacturers continued to print advertisements promising divine whiteness and eternal bloom. The women who read them wanted to believe, because the alternative, to age, to blemish, to fade, was unacceptable. The tragedy of Victorian beauty was not just its danger, but its silence. No one dared admit that their skin was breaking apart, their lips ulcerating, or their minds growing foggy. They powdered over their wounds, smiled politely, and said nothing. The cost of beauty was pain, and they paid it daily, willingly, desperately. The more radiant they appeared, the sicker they became. Behind the shimmer of white faces and shining jewels was a slow poisoning of the flesh, the mind, and the soul. The body could endure much, but vanity asked for everything. The polished glow of Victorian women was not the light of health, but the shimmer of decay. Beneath their powders and pearls, the blood itself was turning toxic. And within that poisoned elegance, another affliction was quietly taking root, one born not of cosmetics, but of the very sunlight they so carefully avoided. In Victorian England, sunlight was considered an enemy of refinement. A pale complexion was the mark of true gentility, proof that a woman did not labour outdoors like the working class. Curtains stayed drawn, bonnets widened, and parasols became essential shields in every lady's hand. What they did not know was that behind the soft glow of their skin, their bones were hollowing, their grace came at the cost of their strength, and each careful step on marble floors carried the quiet ache of decay. It is grimly amusing that in trying to look fragile, Victorian women succeeded more completely than they ever intended. The pale skin ideal was deeply moralized. Doctors and poets alike described whiteness as purity, virtue, and delicacy. Mothers warned daughters against the vulgarity of sunburn, and husbands admired wives who glowed like porcelain. Windows in fine homes were shaded with heavy drapery, and gardens were enjoyed only at dusk. The result was a generation of women who lived in filtered twilight, starved not of food but of sunlight. They could not have known that the rays they feared carried the very substance their bodies needed: vitamin D, the invisible strength that bound flesh to bone. Without it, their skeletons began to weaken. Joints ached with every movement, spines curved, and legs bowed under the weight of their own bodies. At first, the pain was dismissed as fatigue. Physicians called it female frailty, prescribing rest and tonics made of iron or wine. But the more they rested, the worse it became. The women of high society floated through their days like fragile dolls, unaware that each delicate gesture was built on bones turning to dust beneath their corsets. In portraits and letters, the image of the indoor woman was celebrated. Artists painted them reclining on sofas, pale hands folded over embroidered cushions, eyes lowered in modest grace. No one saw the stiffness that came when they tried to rise, or the tremor that followed when they stood too long. To stumble was not simply a matter of balance, it was their bodies quietly collapsing from within. Maids helped their mistresses walk downstairs, pretending not to notice the wincing, the shallow breathing, the faint sound of cracking in the joints. Those who ventured outdoors did so cautiously. Parasols were angled perfectly, gloves covered wrists, and veils shaded every inch of exposed flesh. Even in the countryside, where sunlight painted everything gold, the upper class hid from it. They picnicked under canopies, walked in tree-lined lanes, and retreated indoors at the first sign of warmth. The poor, by contrast, worked in the open and bore the colour of health, though it was seen as coarse and unfeminine. The cruel irony was that the women most admired for their beauty were the ones slowly crumbling inside. Among older women, the damage was unmistakable. Their backs curved, their height diminished, and their movements slowed. Many relied on canes or the arms of servants before reaching middle age. Some were said to wilt with grace, a poetic phrase that hid the truth of brittle bones snapping beneath thin skin. Their fragility became fashionable. Writers praised it as an expression of spiritual sensitivity, as though weakness itself were a virtue. Few recognized it as the symptom of a preventable disease. If we compare it to today, it would be like boasting about never drinking water, then wondering why your body collapses. Even doctors misunderstood. They believed the pain and deformities were natural consequences of femininity, perhaps signs of divine design. Women were encouraged to rest more, move less, and stay indoors to protect their health. Some physicians even prescribed cod liver oil, not knowing it contained the missing vitamin that might have saved countless lives. The oil's smell repulsed many patients, and it was quickly abandoned for sweeter, useless tonics. The cycle continued. In the lower classes, women were too busy to hide from the sun. They scrubbed, cooked, and carried under its glare, their skin darkened but their bones strong. Yet even they began to suffer when industrial smog thickened the skies. The soot that turned white dresses grey also dimmed the sun, and the narrow alleys of the city allowed little light to reach the ground. By the late century, doctors noted that rickets, once thought of as childhood disease, was spreading among adults. The streets themselves were stealing health from those who lived beneath their shadows. Within elegant homes, no one spoke of bone pain or weakness. A lady's suffering was private, hidden behind polite smiles and faint excuses. To limp was unseemly, to complain was vulgar. They used canes decorated with silver handles, turning necessity into fashion. In diaries, they wrote of melancholy in the joints and a heaviness of the limbs, never naming the disease. Their beauty manuals still advised, Avoid the sun's coarse touch. The instructions read like poetry, but they were death sentences written in ink and vanity. The absence of sunlight shaped more than their bodies. It dulled their minds, sapped their spirits, and left them exhausted in ways no tonic could repair. Their rooms were filled with mirrors to catch what little light filtered through curtains, reflections of reflections that offered no warmth. They lived surrounded by a pale imitation of nature, of health, of life itself. The empire that ruled half the world was filled with women who could not stand upright without pain. The glow of their skin, so prized and envied, was not the mark of perfection, but the colour of deprivation. Underneath the powder and lace, bones fractured easily, spines bent silently, and every breath carried a quiet complaint from within. Beauty and illness were no longer separate. They had become the same. Whiteness they worshipped came at a hidden cost. It turned their bodies into fragile statues, beautiful and breakable, shaped by fear of a light that could have saved them. Beneath that cultivated fragility waited another affliction, one born not from sunlight but from what came after, an intimacy with filth that no lace or powder could conceal. In the privacy of Victorian bathrooms, if such a word could even apply to the crude wooden closets and chamber pots of the era, cleanliness was a matter of imagination more than practice. Toilet paper as we know it did not yet exist, and the idea of washing with water after relieving oneself was considered unnecessary, even improper. Instead, scraps of fabric, old rags, or handfuls of straw took their place. The wealthy might have soft linen squares, while the poor relied on whatever the household could spare. What united them all was discomfort. The women who prided themselves on elegance spent their days itching beneath layers of silk and lace, their suffering hidden behind politeness. It is almost comical that a society so obsessed with modesty never realized that its greatest indecency was neglect. The body was never meant to be treated so harshly. The rough texture of dry fabric and straw scratched delicate skin, leaving micro-tears that turned into infections. Worse still, most people reused these materials. Servants washed the cloths in cold water, rarely with soap, and left them to dry by the hearth. The smell lingered, faint but persistent, blending with perfume and powder until no one could tell where cleanliness ended and decay began. The result was a quiet epidemic of irritation, inflammation, and pain that few dared to name. For the upper class, modesty made the problem worse. Women were discouraged from discussing their private parts, even with doctors. If discomfort persisted, it was described vaguely as female unease. Some turned to herbal sachets or perfumed oils, unknowingly worsening the irritation. They did not understand the cause, the dryness, the lack of hygiene, the endless contact with unclean materials. Instead, they blamed their own weakness. Suffering was expected of women. It was the tax of propriety. In cramped homes, where chamber pots sat under beds and bathrooms were shared, sanitation was almost impossible. Water was scarce, and few saw the need to use it for washing after toileting. Towels hung damp for days, collecting bacteria. Maids cleaned them without gloves, spreading infection from one mistress to another. The odour of must and sweat filled the rooms, masked only by the heavy scent of rosewater. Yet these homes were considered clean by the standards of their time. The symptoms appeared slowly, a faint itch at first, then a burning that worsened each evening. Women squirmed in carriages and parlours, unable to sit still. By night, they bathed with cold water, believing it would tighten the flesh. But without soap or proper drying, they only trapped more moisture. Infections became chronic, receding for a few days only to flare again. The pain turned walking, sitting, and even sleeping into quiet endurance. Still, they smiled, powdered their faces, and said nothing. If we compare this to today, it would be like wiping with sandpaper and calling it self-care. Doctors of the time offered little help. They spoke vaguely of uterine congestion or hysteria, prescribing laudanum or bed rest. Some recommended vinegar douches or alum washes, both of which worsened the irritation. A few forward-thinking physicians suggested water, but their advice was met with scandal. To wash oneself down there was seen as indecent, a breach of modesty. Many women preferred to remain in pain rather than risk being thought impure. Among the working class, conditions were harsher still. Shared outdoor privies were damp, dark, and filled with filth. Women used rags hidden beneath their skirts, sometimes shared among family members. They had neither soap nor privacy. Constant contact with grime led to persistent infection, and many went untreated until fever set in. Their discomfort was dismissed as part of poverty, their pain as natural. The body's suffering was invisible beneath the larger misery of labour and hunger. Even in households that considered themselves modern, hygiene was a matter of habit, not health. Cleanliness meant removing visible dirt, not bacteria. Soap was reserved for hands and faces, never for what was unseen. The irony was cruel. Those who most feared being unclean were the ones least willing to understand what cleanliness truly meant. The result was a nation of women living in quiet agony. Their refinement built upon filth. The physical toll was immense. Infections spread to the bladder and womb, causing chronic inflammation. Some women lost fertility without ever understanding why. Others suffered in silence until death, their conditions recorded vaguely as female troubles. The doctors who performed post-mortems found tissues swollen and discoloured, but they wrote nothing in their reports that could disturb the social order. Disease was more acceptable than discussion. The few who broke this silence were ridiculed. Early reformers who suggested regular washing were accused of indecency. Newspapers mocked them as radicals, claiming they wanted to drench womanhood in scandal. Even in death, the truth was softened with euphemisms. No one wanted to admit that improper hygiene, a simple matter of rags and water, could unravel the illusion of Victorian perfection. The discomfort that began with something as ordinary as going to the toilet became a lifelong torment for many women. Every rule of modesty worked against them. Every barrier of shame ensured their pain continued. The result was not purity but disease, cultivated by ignorance and fear. Cleanliness, in the Victorian mind, was about appearance, not health. Beneath their polished manners and lace gloves, their bodies rebelled in secret. The silence surrounding such an intimate issue revealed how fragile the empire's ideals truly were, so fragile that even the act of wiping could destroy them. They suffered for beauty, for decency, for silence itself. But what their bodies endured in secret was only a glimpse of the larger rot spreading through their homes, one that waited on the very objects they sat upon, turning comfort into contagion. Private acts of using the toilet were, for Victorian women, neither private nor safe. In homes and public places alike, toilet seats were made of wood, porous, unvarnished, and shared by everyone. They were rarely cleaned. Servants emptied chamber pots and scrubbed floors, but few ever wiped the seats themselves. Over time, the wood absorbed moisture, urine, and bacteria, turning the surface into a living colony of infection. Women, bound by the weight and length of their skirts, sat upon these seats daily, unaware that each moment of contact carried danger. It is horribly ironic that in the name of decency, Victorian women managed to turn modesty into a form of self-poisoning. Design of the era's toilets made the problem worse. In wealthy homes, water closets were a mark of progress, symbols of modern comfort. But early plumbing was unreliable, and the seats were never disinfected. The wood swelled with heat and damp, trapping filth deep within the grain. For the poor, the situation was even more dreadful. Communal privies served entire streets, their benches slick with moisture and stains from countless users. Rats and insects thrived beneath them. The air was thick with ammonia, and the ground crawled with waste. Yet for women, privacy was a privilege, not a right. They lifted their skirts, endured the smell, and sat quickly, believing that to hover or hesitate was unladylike. Layers of clothing that marked their virtue became their undoing. Heavy petticoats brushed the seat, corsets pressed their bodies forward, and stockings trapped heat and sweat. Once the fabric touched the contaminated surface, it became a carrier, spreading bacteria to the skin. The first signs of infection were small: an itch, a red mark, a tenderness that throbbed at night. But infection in the 19th century was never small for long. Without antiseptics, even a minor wound could turn deadly. The bacteria burrowed beneath the skin, creating abscesses that grew hard and hot. The pain made sitting impossible. Some women could no longer walk. They lay in bed for weeks, feverish and swollen, too ashamed to describe what had happened. Doctors called these conditions boils or inflammations of the lower flesh. Their treatments were brutal. Hot poultices of bread or mustard were applied to the wound, drawing the pus to the surface. When that failed, the skin was cut open with unsterilized blades. The procedures offered little relief. Infection often spreads deeper, poisoning the blood. Women who survived were left with scars and weakness that lasted for life. Some did not survive at all. The cause was rarely recorded accurately. Complications of the abdomen. One death certificate might read, female decline. Another, truth. A wound from a toilet seat was too vulgar to acknowledge. In public houses and markets, toilets were shared by dozens each day. Water was scarce, soap expensive. Cleaning was limited to scattering sawdust or ash on the floor to hide stains. Women used these places quickly, holding their breath as they lowered themselves onto the grimy wood. Servants were the most at risk. They used the same facilities as stable hands and cooks, their skirts brushing filth as they hurried back to work. When infection followed, they were dismissed without pay, accused of laziness or moral failing. Few connected their illness to something as ordinary as a seat. Wealthy households fared little better. Their homes contained what they proudly called modern conveniences, yet the concept of sanitation was still primitive. Maids wiped toilet seats with used cloths, spreading bacteria from one room to another. Scented candles and potpourri masked odours, but did nothing to stop disease. Even when marble replaced wood in luxury bathrooms, water that flushed through pipes was often contaminated. Illusion of progress hid the reality of filth. If we compare it to today, it would be like building a crystal chandelier in a room filled with sewage. Women's magazines, always eager to instruct, offered advice that bordered on tragic. They suggested placing dried herbs near the toilet to sweeten the air or sprinkling powder on the seat before use. Some even recommended sitting on a folded handkerchief, though few washed them afterward. Infection became almost inevitable. Those who developed abscesses often sought spiritual explanations. They prayed, repented, and blamed their own impurity, never realizing that the sin lay not in their bodies but in the ignorance that surrounded them. Among the cases whispered about by doctors, one stood out. A lady of high birth, barely 40, developed what was first described as a mild sore on her thigh. Within a week, she could no longer walk. The abscess grew until it ruptured, releasing infection into her bloodstream. Her body swelled, her breathing slowed, and she died within days. Her servants burned her bedding and clothes, terrified of contamination. Family declared she had succumbed to a fever of mysterious origin. No one dared speak the word toilet. Victorian women were taught that modesty was protection, that silence preserved virtue. In truth, it killed them. Their fear of speaking about their own bodies ensured their suffering continued unnoticed. Even those who survived the infections carried their shame quietly, never mentioning the scars beneath their skirts. It was better to limp discreetly than to confess what caused it. As sanitation improved toward the end of the century, reforms began to appear. Enamel seats replaced wood, soap became more available, and indoor plumbing spread. But old habits of secrecy lingered. Women still avoided discussing hygiene, and ignorance still bred illness. The legacy of those wooden seats remained, a symbol of how propriety could turn deadly. Toilets of Victorian England were meant to represent civilization, yet they stood as monuments to denial. An infection that began in a seat travelled far beyond the body. It revealed a society that preferred death to embarrassment, sickness to truth. Fear that kept them silent about pain would not end there. It would creep into other corners of their lives, turning even the most natural needs into sources of hidden torment. Victorian women carried their restraint into every aspect of life, even the most basic functions of the body. To relieve oneself outside the home was seen as shameful, a lapse in composure unfit for a lady. Public toilets were rare, filthy, and shared by strangers. The air inside them stank of ammonia and rot, the wooden seats damp, the floor crawling with refuse. Women would rather suffer than enter such places. They trained their bodies to hold back, day after day, ignoring the cramps and pain that followed. Over time, their dignity turned against them, transforming simple discomfort into illness. It is almost darkly humorous that the same women who conquered every social occasion were defeated by their own bowels. The refusal to defecate in public was both a matter of modesty and survival. The toilets in Victorian streets were designed for men, open and crude. Women had to rely on shared privies, filthy corners of taverns, or the privacy of the countryside if desperation forced them. Their long skirts trapped heat and odour, adding to the humiliation, so they stopped going altogether. On long trips by carriage or train, they would drink little water, eat less, and clench through hours of discomfort. When nature called, they ignored it until it hurt. The body, forced into obedience, began to fail. Constipation was common among upper-class women. They ate refined foods heavy with starch and sugar, but lacking fibre. Combined with corsets that compressed their stomachs and intestines, digestion slowed to a crawl. The abdomen swelled, the skin tightened, and nausea set in. Some women went a week without relief. The discomfort became part of life, spoken of in delicate euphemisms: sluggish health, delicate digestion, a heaviness in the stomach. What was truly happening was the slow poisoning of their own systems by waste that refused to leave. Doctors, steeped in the same culture of modesty, rarely asked direct questions. Instead, they prescribed tonics, laudanum, or even arsenic mixtures to stimulate the organs. Some recommended abstinence from solid food or gentle carriage rides for bowel encouragement. None of it worked. The woman smiled through the pain, walking stiffly to keep up appearances. They refused to speak of it to their friends or husbands. Their silence was praised as composure, their endurance mistaken for grace. Among the poor, the problem was different but equally cruel. Their privies overflowed, shared by entire neighbourhoods. Flies and rats thrived among the waste. Women waited until dark to relieve themselves outdoors, risking harassment or arrest. Fear and shame made them hold it in. Their diets were low in vegetables and high in cheap bread and tea, which worsened the condition. The pain became constant, yet they too called it normal. The obsession with cleanliness twisted into superstition. Some women believed that bowel movements were signs of weakness, that excessive evacuation drained vital energy. Health manuals warned against straining, advising instead to preserve inner calm and control. So they controlled until control became disease. By middle age, many suffered from hemorrhoids, prolapse, and chronic inflammation. But propriety demanded they speak of none of it. If we compare it to today, it would be like refusing to use any restroom outside your home, no matter how far you travel, and calling that elegance. Those who sought relief turned to laxatives and teas. Apothecaries sold digestive blends made from senna leaves, cascara, and even mercury chloride. They worked too well, causing cramps and dehydration. Some women grew dependent, their bowels unable to move without a dose. The tea became part of their morning ritual, as essential as powder or perfume. Advertisements praised it as a beauty product, claiming it lightened the body and refined the figure. The truth was uglier. These women lived in cycles of pain and purge, their bodies swinging between stagnation and agony. Corsets compounded everything. The constant pressure on the abdomen left no room for digestion. Food lingered for hours, fermentation followed, and gas expanded painfully beneath layers of bone and whalebone. The abdomen pressed upward into the lungs, making breathing shallow and sleep restless. Many women mistook this for anxiety, a common diagnosis that conveniently hid the real cause. They sipped peppermint water and lay still, afraid that movement might expose their discomfort. Servants witnessed these habits more closely than anyone. They cleaned the chamber pots that remained empty for days, then suddenly filled after a night of herbal purging. They washed soiled linens in silence, never speaking of what they saw. Their mistress's dignity depended on their discretion. Behind the elegance of the drawing rooms and the fragrance of roses, there was always a faint undercurrent of sickness, silent, chronic, and entirely preventable. Reformers who spoke of digestive health were mocked. To discuss such things in print was vulgar. Pamphlets promoting fresh air, exercise, and outdoor activity were ridiculed as mannish nonsense. True ladies, society insisted, stayed inside, composed and pale. The very behaviours that signified femininity destroyed their health from within. The quiet constipation of Victorian women was more than a medical condition. It was a reflection of their world. Everything was contained, repressed, and hidden beneath layers of fabric and shame. Their bodies obeyed the same rules as their minds do not express, do not release, do not reveal. What began as modesty became a slow suffocation of the body's most basic needs. The empire's elegance rested on the discomfort of its women, who smiled as their organs cried for relief. Restraint had become a religion, and the body its most faithful martyr. Yet this self-denial did not stop at digestion. It would soon reach the skin itself, where pain and beauty collided in ways even more unbearable. Victorian homes, no matter how grand or humble, shared one curious truth: hygiene was collective. Bathing was not an individual act but a family affair, and the very objects meant to keep the body clean often turned into silent carriers of disease. In wealthy homes, the bathtub, usually made of tin, copper, or porcelain, was considered a mark of refinement, yet it was rarely emptied and refilled for each person. The head of the household bathed first, followed by his wife, then the children, and finally the servants. By the end of the ritual, the once clear water had turned grey, carrying the residue of sweat, oil, and skin cells from every body that had touched it. It is almost comical to think that the same people who feared dirt on their hands willingly soaked in a human soup of bacteria. Cleanliness was a symbol of status, but understanding of it was dangerously shallow. Victorians believed that water itself had purifying power, even if it was cloudy and cold. The idea of germs was not yet widespread, so as long as the bathwater smelled faintly of lavender or rose, it was considered safe. A few drops of perfume could disguise the filth, and that was enough. After the bath, towels were shared just as freely. Each family typically had only a few, large pieces of linen or cotton that rotated between members. These towels were washed only once a week, sometimes less. Between uses, they hung damp in unventilated rooms, becoming a breeding ground for mildew and bacteria. Servants fared even worse. Their turn to bathe came last, in water already tepid and darkened by those above them in rank. They were expected to make do with what remained, scrubbing quickly before chores resumed. Some households allowed servants only to wash their faces and hands in separate basins, reusing the same cloths that cleaned furniture or boots. Skin infections spread easily through this routine. Tiny scratches became red, then swollen, then crusted with pus. but to complain was unthinkable. Servants who mentioned rashes risked being accused of laziness or unclean habits. The middle class adopted similar customs with pride, believing they imitated aristocratic refinement. They also shared basins, sponges, and towels among family members. In houses with limited space, a single washstand served everyone. Children dipped their hands in the same bowl that their father had used to rinse after shaving. Mothers wiped their faces with the same damp towel from the morning before. It was a ritual of affection and ignorance intertwined. No one thought about what remained on the fabric. In modern terms, it would be like a family sharing one toothbrush and calling it togetherness. Among women, shared hygiene tools carried even greater risk. Hairbrushes, combs, and sponges passed from one hand to another. Head lice and skin fungi spread invisibly, embedding themselves in the bristles. Beauty routines were supposed to signify discipline and grace. Yet behind the polished hair and powdered faces lurked infections that never fully healed. Women developed chronic dermatitis, flaky patches along the hairline, and sores on their scalps. Physicians dismissed them as female sensitivity or blamed excessive vanity. Few considered the humble brush as the cause. Bathhouses and spas offered another illusion of cleanliness. In cities, public bathhouses were advertised as symbols of progress, places where modern hygiene met luxury. But the reality was far less glamorous. Hundreds of visitors used the same basins, towels, and sponges each week. Water circulated through pipes that were never disinfected. The faint scent of eucalyptus or sulphur could not mask the truth. Skin diseases flourished. Ringworm, impetigo, and scabies found perfect breeding grounds there. Workers rubbed backs, scraped dead skin, and reused the same cloths for the next client. Women seeking relaxation often left with itching and irritation that lasted for months. Inside private homes, even the wealthy could not escape. The very fabrics that wrapped their luxury, silk, velvet, lace, trapped sweat and oil. When mixed with the infrequent washing of towels and linens, the environment turned ideal for infection. Dermatologists of the late century recorded a surge in domestic contagions, skin conditions that spread within households but never left the home. They passed quietly from towel to towel, pillow to pillow, until every member showed the same lesions. Cleanliness became performance rather than practice. Scented soaps were prized not for their cleaning power, but for their fragrance. Guests would admire the neatly folded towels embroidered with family crests, unaware that they were last used days before. Servants dried them in damp attics, where air never fully cleared the moisture. By morning they were cool and slightly sour to the touch, yet they looked presentable. For Victorians, appearance mattered more than health. A fresh scent was proof enough of purity. The consequences grew worse in winter, when cold air and scarce sunlight kept homes closed tight. Damp towels never dried, and baths became rarer. Families washed less, but they continued to share everything. Skin cracked, infections festered, and the idea of winter rash became so common that it entered household vocabulary. No one thought to connect it with the towels they used each day. Doctors prescribed ointments and tonics, yet the true cure, a clean, dry cloth, remained elusive simply because it seemed too ordinary. Even when germ theory finally emerged toward the end of the century, denial persisted. To suggest that the disease could travel through a shared towel was insulting. It implied a lack of refinement, an accusation no Victorian lady would tolerate. So they continued their rituals of ignorance, sprinkling perfume over damp linens and calling it cleanliness. It was not until hospitals began enforcing sterilization in the early 20th century that the upper classes slowly accepted the connection between fabric and infection. But by then, countless women had lived and died under the quiet tyranny of their own homes. Their skin told the story, thin, inflamed, covered in faint scars where infections had once bloomed. Servants who laundered their clothes bore similar marks, reminders of a system that prized elegance over health. The towel, once a symbol of domestic grace, had become a silent accomplice to decay. Still, the illusion of control comforted them. To bathe weekly, to dry with embroidered cloth, to smell faintly of lavender. All this gave the sense of order in a chaotic world. They believed that filth belonged to the poor, not realizing that dirt could hide even in satin and lace. Their homes gleamed with mirrors and porcelain, but under every clean surface lingered a quiet truth. They were all sharing the same invisible disease. What began as vanity ended as vulnerability. The very habits meant to preserve beauty and decorum turned against their bodies, spreading infection through intimacy and routine. Yet they never stopped. To change would mean admitting they had been wrong, and Victorian pride was far too polished for that. The culture of shared hygiene left more than stains on skin. It left a legacy of misconceptions that cleanliness could exist without cleanliness itself. They believed they were protecting their dignity, but they were only nurturing disease in silence. Those silent infections would not stay limited to the skin for long. They would travel inward, settling in places far more dangerous, where the damage could not be seen until it was too late. Corsets were more than garments in Victorian society. They were cages for both the body and the skin. Women wore them from morning until night, often even sleeping in lighter versions designed for bedtime. The constant pressure sealed the skin beneath layers of fabric, whalebone, and metal clasps, trapping heat and moisture against the flesh. As the hours passed, sweat collected in the folds beneath the corset's edges, mixing with body oils and dust. The result was irritation so deep that it burned. Red patches appeared first, then tiny bumps, and eventually painful pustules along the ribs and back. It is grimly amusing that what was meant to create beauty on the outside quietly destroyed it from within. Daily life offered no relief. To remove the corset during the day was considered indecent, a sign of weakness. Women tightened them before meals and loosened them only slightly before bed. Underneath, the skin never breathed. Cotton chemises absorbed some moisture, but the cloth soon became damp and sour, clinging to the body. The pressure of the steel busks rubbed constantly against the same points, cutting into the skin until small sores appeared. Each movement, sitting, bending, breathing, reopened them. Infection entered easily through these wounds, festering beneath fabric that no one ever saw. Household dust added another layer of torment, with windows rarely opened and coal soot settling everywhere. Fine black particles gathered on every surface. They found their way into corset linings and seams, lodging inside damp fabric already rich with bacteria. When pressed against the skin for days at a time, this grime became part of the body itself. The woman itched, scratched in secret, and smiled through pain. They powdered their chests and backs to hide the redness, pretending it was only irritation from heat. Yet beneath the lace and perfume the sores deepened. Doctors described these outbreaks delicately as heat eruptions or corset rash, but many cases were far more severe. Without ventilation or cleaning, follicles became infected. The small red spots turned into abscesses, leaking fluid and leaving scars that no amount of powder could disguise. Some women developed fevers and nausea, unaware that bacteria were entering their bloodstream. In a time before antiseptics, such infections could linger for months, draining energy and appetite. If we compare it to today, it would be like wearing a plastic suit every day, 24 hours a day, and calling it fashion. Laundering the garments did little to help. Corsets were expensive and fragile, often cleaned only once every few months. The linen lining that touched the skin absorbed sweat, but few replaced it regularly. Instead, they sprinkled talc or starch inside to absorb moisture, creating a paste-like residue that trapped more dirt. Metal hooks corroded from the acidity of sweat, their rust pressing into tiny cuts. A dull ache under the ribs or between the shoulder blades became an accepted part of womanhood, mentioned only in whispers among close friends. Servants who laced their mistresses' corsets saw the marks firsthand. When tightening the laces, they noticed the reddish rings that wrapped around the torso and the damp stains along the seams. Some applied cloths soaked in vinegar or camphor to soothe the skin, but the relief never lasted. The following morning, the ritual began again. Tighten until you can barely breathe, smile, and walk tall. Every scratch and sting was hidden beneath silk and self-discipline. Society rewarded this suffering. A smooth waist was a symbol of refinement, a sign that a woman belonged to the world of manners and money. Doctors even praised corsets for promoting graceful posture and supporting delicate organs. Women learned to ignore discomfort, to call it elegance. Skin diseases were treated as personal flaws rather than consequences of their clothing. When infections became too painful to ignore, physicians prescribed powders or ointments made with mercury or lead, poisons that made matters worse. The wealthy tried to adapt by wearing silk liners or perfumed pads, but these only masked the problem. Silk trapped heat even more effectively than cotton. Perfume burned when applied to broken skin, yet they used it anyway, convinced that smelling clean meant being clean. Meanwhile, poorer women wore rougher, cheaper corsets that cut into their flesh and left permanent indentations. Some resorted to wrapping themselves with cloth strips or rags, believing pressure would prevent sagging bodies. The result was the same sores, rashes, and scars. The emotional cost was as real as the physical one. The constant irritation wore down the nerves. Sleep was difficult. Every turn in bed rubbed against raw skin. Women grew restless and irritable, often diagnosed with female hysteria, as if their pain were imaginary. In truth, their bodies were crying out for air. The need to remain attractive, disciplined, and composed overrode every instinct for comfort. They lived in bodies that were polished prisons, beautiful from afar but crumbling beneath the surface. When the corset finally came off, if it came off, the damage was visible. Skin beneath the ribs was pale and blotchy, crossed with red lines where the fabric had bitten deep. Tiny boils clustered near the waist, some still oozing. Servants cleaned the garments while trying not to stare. Women dabbed rosewater on their wounds and put the corset back on the next morning, pretending everything was fine. There is something quietly tragic about how far people will go to appear unbothered. The fashion industry of the era thrived on this silent endurance. Magazines printed illustrations of impossibly narrow waists, praising those who could lace tighter each year. Not one of those drawings hinted at the infections hiding beneath the satin. The public admired the outer form but never questioned the cost. It took decades and countless ruined bodies for society to see that beauty and pain were not the same. Even as looser styles emerged in the early 20th century, the scars of corset living remained. Many women carried faint marks around their midsections for life, physical memories of an age that demanded suffering and silence. Their skin told the truth their manners never could. Those infections were not just signs of vanity gone wrong. They were proof of a culture that valued appearances above health. And just as skin bore the marks of pressure and sweat, another part of the body would soon bear its own punishment from the same relentless ideals. Among the most disturbing tragedies of Victorian vanity were the women who refused to loosen their corsets for months at a time. For them, the garment was not simply clothing but a symbol of discipline and social worth. Some wore it day and night, through sleep and sickness, believing that removing it would undo years of shaping their ideal form. Over time, the pressure of metal and bone against flesh became unbearable, yet they endured it in silence. The skin beneath those layers darkened, blistered, and began to rot. It is hauntingly absurd that women so obsessed with purity allowed themselves to decay beneath their own elegance. The body's surface is not meant to be suffocated. Beneath the corset's rigid frame, sweat could not evaporate, air could not circulate, and wounds could not heal. Friction between the stays and the skin caused abrasions, which soon turned into open sores. Dust and bacteria entered through these wounds, trapped in the moist warmth created by tight clothing. Slowly, tissue began to die. The first sign was a dull pain, often ignored. Then came a sour odour, faint at first but impossible to conceal. Servants tasked with dressing their mistresses sometimes noticed the smell before their employers did. They whispered about it in hallways, not daring to speak aloud. When the corset was finally unlaced, usually after weeks of wear, the sight beneath was horrifying. Skin peeled away with the lining. Beneath it, flesh had turned greyish and soft. The lesions oozed with infection. Some women fainted upon seeing their reflection. Others insisted it was nothing more than a rash. Doctors, summoned too late, called it necrosis. But even as the pain worsened, few would allow their bodies to rest. They ordered stronger perfumes and powders to mask the odour, convinced that smell, not sickness, was the enemy. The servants who attended these women often bore the worst of it. They cleaned the wounds with trembling hands, gagging at the stench, then redressed their mistresses as though nothing had happened. One fainted while changing a woman whose back had begun to rot from shoulder to waist. The decaying flesh released gases that burned the eyes and throat. Yet the patient insisted on being laced again, declaring that no lady should appear undressed, even in bed. Such devotion to form surpassed reason. It bordered on madness. Medical records from the late 19th century quietly mention these cases. Physicians described gangrenous decay of the dorsal tissues in women of high society. Their corsets had cut off circulation so thoroughly that the skin died from lack of oxygen. In one notorious instance, a woman's back was eaten away so deeply that bone became visible. Rather than remove the garment permanently, she demanded that the damaged section be padded to maintain symmetry. She died of infection weeks later, her body embalmed in the very object that killed her. The irony was cruel. Corsets were marketed as instruments of beauty and posture, meant to protect delicate spines and enhance health. The tighter they were, the more respectable the woman appeared. To loosen one's laces was seen as vulgar, almost immoral. Doctors warned that over-tightening might impair digestion, but few imagined it could cause death. Only when the infection spread to the bloodstream did they realize how fragile the human body becomes when trapped inside an idea of perfection. To mask the odor of decay, women turned to fragrance. Rosewater, jasmine, and violet oils were poured directly onto the wounds, their sting mistaken for cleansing. Perfume bottles became tools of denial. When the smell returned stronger, more scent was applied until the mixture of rot and roses filled the room. Visitors complained of nausea, attributing it to stifling perfumes. No one dared to imagine that beneath the satin gowns and lace gloves, death was quietly spreading inch by inch. Those who survived carried scars for life. Surgeons cut away infected flesh, leaving hollows that never fully healed. Some women could no longer wear gowns that revealed their shoulders or backs. They became reclusive, hiding their disfigurement behind layers of shawls and veils. Society, ever obsessed with appearances, whispered but never asked. To them, illness was weakness, and weakness was shame. So the silence continued, as if ignoring decay could make it disappear. The moral decay mirrored the physical one. Vanity had consumed compassion, turning beauty into punishment. Women who once prided themselves on refinement now lived in pain, bound by fabrics meant to project control. The corset had promised grace but delivered suffering. The steel that held their bodies upright became their slowest form of ruin. It is difficult not to feel a quiet grief for those who traded comfort for acceptance and found neither. Corsetry manuals never spoke of such consequences. They featured illustrations of flawless silhouettes, each narrower than the last. Behind every perfect waist in those images lay unseen infections, fevers, and scars. The public applauded the illusion while the truth festered beneath ribbons and boning. Every compliment reinforced the lie that endurance was elegance, that pain was the price of worth. When reformers eventually called for looser clothing, many resisted, claiming the corset was essential to civility. They could not imagine life without it, as if the garment had fused to their very identity. In truth, for some, it already had flesh and fabric united by decay. The slow, sweet scent of perfume lingering over infection became a metaphor for the entire age, beauty applied over rot, denial scented with grace. It was not the corset alone that killed them, but the silence that accompanied it. The refusal to admit that suffering existed beneath luxury. Those deaths were whispered away, recorded as fevers or infections of unknown cause. But everyone who had stood close enough to breathe that smell knew the truth. The back that had once arched proudly beneath silk now lay motionless, eaten away by the very thing that made it beautiful. What began as a symbol of poise ended as a monument to ruin. In their pursuit of elegance, they became prisoners of decay, embalmed by fashion before they were ever buried. Beneath the glamour, there was only silence, perfume, and the faint echo of fabric pulling tight for the last time. Eyes were among the most delicate features Victorian women tried to perfect, yet few realized how their daily routines quietly destroyed them. Cosmetics, dust, and careless habits turned something as simple as touching one's face into a danger. The eyes, constantly exposed yet rarely protected, suffered in silence beneath layers of powder and soot. Many women reached for their mirrors each morning with hands that had already touched the floor, fabrics, hair, and even coal from the fire. They dipped their fingers into small jars of eye colour, rubbed the pigment between their fingertips, and spread it gently across the lids. What seemed elegant and harmless was, in truth, the beginning of slow, invisible harm. It feels darkly ironic that the same hands used to create beauty were also the instruments of its decay. Dust filled every Victorian home. The streets were unpaved, and horse manure mixed with ash from chimneys, and wind carried that mixture indoors through open windows. It settled on furniture, curtains, and skin. No matter how often servants dusted, it returned within hours. When women applied makeup, their fingers were never clean. Coal dust from fireplaces and lamps clung to skin and nails, entering small jars of coal or soot-based pigment. Each application pressed those particles closer to the eyes, scratching the surface and infecting the tender membranes. The pain began as a mild irritation, a faint sting mistaken for tiredness or dryness. But soon redness appeared, followed by swelling and a discharge that blurred vision. Victorian beauty guides spoke little of hygiene. They encouraged natural powders and home remedies, mixtures of charcoal, ash, and even lead-based paints. Women ground these at home, often on tables used for meals, using tools that were never washed properly. A single speck of dirt in the powder could carry bacteria into the tear ducts. Some ladies mixed their colours with saliva or rosewater to make them easier to apply, unaware that these mixtures bred microbes within hours. When infection appeared, they covered it with more powder, a cruel cycle of irritation hidden beneath artifice. Glasses offered no relief. Spectacles were seen as unfeminine, a sign of aging or weakness. Many women avoided wearing them in public, preferring to strain their eyes instead. When they did use them, the lenses were seldom cleaned. Each day, fine dust is collected on the glass, mixing with oil from the skin. Without regular washing, the lenses turned cloudy, forcing wearers to squint and lean closer to objects. The strain led to headaches, dizziness, and worsening vision. Yet few admitted it. Vanity and ignorance worked together to make blindness fashionable. Doctors of the era noted a rise in what they called ocular inflammation among women of refinement. They attributed it to overuse of reading lamps or the emotional frailty of women rather than the real culprit: filth. The dark powders that lined the eyes often contained ingredients like antimony or mercury, which slowly poisoned the tissue. Some women experienced tremors or fainting, unaware that it was their cosmetics entering the bloodstream through the delicate skin of the eyelids. If we compared it to today, it would be like using car exhaust as eyeliner and wondering why your eyes burn. The process of application was itself a ritual of risk. Without proper brushes, many women use small sticks, pins, or even the ends of feathers to trace pigment along their eyelids. These makeshift tools were rarely cleaned and often splintered. Small cuts appeared near the lashes, unnoticed until they became infected. The eyes watered constantly, smudging the pigment, which led to reapplication throughout the day. Each touch introduced more dirt. By evening, the eyes were swollen and tender, the lids heavy with inflammation. But rather than rest them, women often reached for cooling tonics made of camphor or alcohol, both of which stung but provided a temporary sense of relief. Even those who avoided cosmetics were not safe. The habit of rubbing tired eyes with unwashed hands was common. Work, sewing, and cleaning all coated the fingers in dust and grime. Touching the face transferred it directly into the eyes. Servants suffered most. Coal dust and soot from chimneys entered their pores and clung beneath nails. After long hours of work, they would wipe their faces without washing, embedding filth in their tear ducts. Many developed conjunctivitis so severe that they could barely open their eyes in the morning. Yet they worked on, wiping away discharge with the same handkerchief used for cleaning surfaces. The connection between cleanliness and sight was not yet understood. When infections became severe, Victorians blamed the weather, bad air, or overexertion. Women wrapped their eyes with damp cloth soaked in milk or vinegar, believing it would soothe the irritation. It rarely helped. Some even applied leeches near the temples to draw out the heat. Others turned to strange remedies sold by travelling apothecaries, bottles of tonic that claimed to brighten the eyes. Most were mixtures of alcohol and herbs that burned the skin but dulled the pain. None stopped the infections from spreading. In crowded cities, the problem worsened. Smoke from factories and gas lamps filled the air, coating everything in a fine film of soot. Women who wore veils thought they were protecting themselves, but the thin fabric caught dust and funneled it toward the eyes. The combination of unwashed hands, contaminated cosmetics, and filthy air created a perfect storm of disease. Opticians of the time recorded an alarming rise in partial blindness, yet few connected it to these habits. The blindness of the wealthy was often considered a sign of refinement, as if suffering were proof of moral superiority. The cycle of infection and denial mirrored the entire structure of Victorian life. Cleanliness was pursued in appearance but ignored in practice. So long as the mirror reflected elegance, the unseen dirt did not matter. Eyes reddened from infection were described as soulful or expressive. The haze of pain was mistaken for mystery. The truth, that many women were slowly losing their sight to their own vanity, was buried under layers of powder and pride. Those who lived in rural areas faced different dangers. Without access to proper washing facilities, they relied on water drawn from wells contaminated with bacteria. Washing one's face with this water introduced new infections. In homes lit by oil lamps, smoke and soot clung to everything, making even rest a hazard. When infections worsened, rural women often turned to local healers who used herbal poultices. Some of these worked temporarily, but most trapped moisture against the skin, spreading bacteria deeper. The resulting ulcers sometimes scarred the eyelids permanently. Sight was considered a gift, yet it was treated with astonishing carelessness. Victorian women prized vision for reading letters, sewing, and admiring their reflections. But few gave thought to how easily it could be lost. Each act of vanity carried a cost, one that time would collect slowly and without mercy. The dim rooms, the smoky air, and the unwashed fingers combined to turn beauty into blindness. It's unsettling to realize that blindness was not caused by fate, but by fingertips. The same gestures that shaped elegance, touching powder, adjusting spectacles, tracing eyeliner, were the very ones that delivered disease. Their reflection in the mirror may have looked graceful, but it was built upon slow destruction. By the end of the century, reformers began to speak of hygiene and sight, urging women to wash their hands and clean their cosmetics. But habits born of ignorance are hard to break. Vanity whispered louder than reason, and the damage had already been done. Eyes that once sparkled behind lace veils now wept constantly, dimmed by years of neglect, and while infection took their vision, another kind of blindness, the refusal to see truth, had already claimed them long before. Those dim eyes would not be the last victims of careless beauty. The same culture that poisoned sight would soon find new ways to harm what remained, turning even small acts of care into quiet ruin. Among the countless habits of Victorian women, few were as deceptive in their elegance as the constant use of perfumed silk handkerchiefs. These delicate squares of fabric, soaked in strong floral oils, were pressed to the nose at every step outdoors. The streets were filled with smoke, manure, and human waste, so a sweet scent seemed like salvation. Women lifted their handkerchiefs to their faces whenever a foul odour drifted by, breathing deeply through the heavy layers of perfume. The gesture looked graceful, almost refined, but each breath drew chemicals and concentrated oils deep into the lungs. It is unsettling to think that they were slowly suffocating in the name of sophistication. The perfumes used were not gentle blends. They were thick, oily substances distilled from plants, mixed with alcohol, and left to steep for months. Cheap imitations were made from industrial solvents and animal fats. Many contained ingredients like benzene, turpentine, or camphor, substances that today would carry warning labels. Yet in the 19th century, they were marketed as luxury scents. The stronger the smell, the higher the status it suggested. A faint fragrance was seen as a weakness. Ladies competed for intensity, carrying handkerchiefs so drenched in oil that they left stains on gloves and sleeves. Each inhale coated the nose and throat with residue. At first, it caused nothing more than dizziness or coughing, easily dismissed as fatigue. But over time, the chemicals inflamed the airways. Women began to experience shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, and wheezing fits. Doctors, unfamiliar with allergic reactions, called it delicate lungs or female faintness. The truth was simpler. They were inhaling poison by choice. In crowded ballrooms, the air grew thick with perfume. Dozens of women waved or pressed scented handkerchiefs to their faces, creating an invisible fog of chemicals. The mingled odours of roses, lavender, musk, and alcohol clung to the walls and curtains. Men complained quietly of headaches. Servants fainted from the overpowering mix. Still, the women smiled, proud of their refinement. The faintness they felt was even seen as fashionable, a mark of femininity. If we compare it to today, it would be like attending a dinner party inside a cloud of cleaning spray and calling it elegance. Perfume was more than a mask for street smells. It was armour against class. To smell sweet was to appear clean and superior. Women of lower means could not afford such a luxury, and the wealthy flaunted their scents to set themselves apart. The irony was cruel. While the poor struggled with the stench of open sewers, the rich poisoned themselves trying to forget it. Inhaling perfume became a way of proving one's refinement. The deeper the breath, the higher the status. Some perfumes cause more harm than others. Synthetic musks and floral oils often contain traces of lead or mercury from unregulated production. When heated by body warmth, these metals released vapours that irritated the lungs. Chronic exposure led to coughing, nosebleeds, and even fainting. A few women developed what physicians called perfume palsy, tremors, and confusion caused by inhaling toxic fumes. But no one dared blame beauty. To do so would have been an admission that elegance itself was dangerous. Servants who ironed these handkerchiefs suffered just as badly. The heat released a wave of fumes that filled their small laundry rooms. They worked in silence, breathing the same toxins their employers paid fortunes to enjoy. When dizziness struck, they opened windows and carried on. Victorian society had no patience for weakness among workers. Suffering, both physical and social, was expected to remain invisible. During long carriage rides or walks through crowded markets, women pressed their perfumed scarves tightly against their mouths, trying to block out the city's odours. Some fainted without warning. In medical journals, fainting among upper-class women became so common that it was treated almost like a fashion statement. Doctors prescribed tonics, smelling salts, or fresh air, never suspecting that the cause lay in the very fragrance their patients adored. A few who fainted in public were carried away still clutching their handkerchiefs, their faces pale and scented like funeral flowers. Perfume bottles themselves were works of art, crystal, enamel, and silver, objects too beautiful to question, but inside them the mixtures fermented and darkened. When applied to silk, the oils grew stronger over time, not weaker. A scarf worn for weeks carried more fumes than a modern bottle of solvent. Even after washing, the smell remained. The women themselves became walking vessels of chemical sweetness, their very breath perfumed, their lungs lined with residue. There were warnings, of course. Some physicians noted the growing number of women who suffered from what they called respiratory fatigue. They advised moderation, suggesting lighter scents or fresh air. But moderation had no place in Victorian vanity. To appear delicate, one had to suffer visibly. A cough or fainting spell could even enhance the image of frailty. Pain became proof of beauty's authenticity. Behind closed doors, however, the symptoms grew worse. Women woke in the night, gasping for breath. They felt heaviness in their chests and dizziness upon standing. Some mistook it for the onset of tuberculosis, a common fear in those days, but their lungs were being suffocated not by disease, but by luxury. When one lady collapsed during a ballroom dance, her friends assumed it was exhaustion. In truth, her airways were swollen shut from chemical irritation. The physician who attended her noted the overpowering scent of jasmine oil and wrote vaguely of asphyxiation due to nervous excitement. There is something quietly tragic about how beauty is often disguised as self-destruction. The women who spent their lives pursuing purity of scent ended up choking on it. The men who admired them never smelled the decay beneath the perfume, only the illusion of grace. The obsession with fragrance extended beyond clothing. Homes were filled with potpourri, incense, and burning oils. Bedrooms reeked of artificial flowers, drawing rooms of musk. Even in sleep, their lungs found no rest. The air was a constant mixture of sweetness and suffocation. The image of a woman fainting at a ball, her silk scarf slipping from her hand, became a cliché of Victorian art. Pain was prettified, made romantic. What those paintings never showed was the truth. The bluish lips, the trembling hands, the shallow breaths that followed. No one painted the aftermath, when servants carried her to a cold room, opened a window, and tried to wake her while the perfume lingered like a ghost. They did not die from perfume alone, but each breath carried them closer to weakness, confusion, and collapse. Perfume, meant to mask the rot of the city, became its own invisible plague. The more they inhaled, the less they truly breathed, and in the quiet of their ornate rooms, another danger waited, one not in the air, but at the table, disguised as nourishment itself. By the late Victorian years, hunger itself had become a symbol of restraint. Women prided themselves on their ability to resist food, believing that an empty stomach meant purity, that lightness of body meant lightness of soul. Meals were treated as moral tests rather than nourishment. At gatherings, they nibbled on biscuits and drank tea, refusing bread or meat for fear of smelling unclean. The connection between scent and sin ran deep. It was said that heavy foods made a person earthly, that real ladies should smell only of flowers, never of flesh. It is painfully ironic that in their quest to appear pure, they were slowly starving themselves into decay. Trays of food were carried past them, steaming with roasted meats and puddings, but many looked away. They preferred tea laced with herbs that dulled hunger, or the bitter taste of tonics meant to cleanse the body. Pharmacies sold powders promising fragrant health, which were nothing more than mild laxatives. These cleansers stripped the body of nutrients and left women weak, dizzy, and pale. Still, they smiled through exhaustion, believing faintness was elegance. To eat freely was vulgar, to suffer quietly was divine. The body cannot survive long under such rules. Without proper nourishment, skin lost its colour, hair grew brittle, and lips turned dry and cracked. Women whispered of fatigue of the nerves, yet it was starvation, plain and simple. Servants noticed that their mistresses' hands trembled when lifting teacups, that their gowns hung loose where flesh had once been. Some could no longer walk far without rest. Doctors diagnosed female weakness or nervous collapse, prescribing rest and mild broths. None dared name hunger as the cause. If we compared it to today, it would be like starving oneself for a social media image, polished misery packaged as grace. The irony was that food was abundant for the wealthy. Tables overflowed with fruit, bread, and game. Yet many women measured virtue by what they refused to eat. They claimed that heavy meals made one sweat, that meat caused unpleasant odours. To avoid the imagined shame of smell, they drank tea and water flavoured with lemon instead. The result was frailty mistaken for refinement. Men admired their delicacy without realising it was a symptom of deprivation. Magazines printed diet plans disguised as advice for modest living. One article recommended eating air and drinking light. Another praised the virtues of fasting for moral discipline. Girls grew up watching their mothers push food away, learning that hunger was not suffering but style. In a world that worshipped control, appetite became rebellion. To feel full was indecent. Inside drawing rooms, gossip often revolved around who had the smallest waist or the faintest scent. Food, when discussed, was treated as a nuisance. Some women confessed they could no longer tolerate the smell of meat cooking. Others avoided kitchens entirely, afraid the odour might cling to their hair or gowns. The air of denial thickened as health declined. Those who fainted during church services were praised for their piety. Thinness became holiness. The body responded with slow rebellion. Without enough protein or minerals, wounds refused to heal. Bones grew brittle, teeth loosened, and the immune system collapsed. Women who once prided themselves on never sweating began to smell of sickness, a faint, metallic odour that no perfume could hide. Servants whispered about it behind closed doors, calling it the scent of dying grace. Doctors noted that recovery was difficult even with nourishment restored. Starvation had left permanent scars inside the body. The mind suffered too. Malnutrition dulled the senses, clouding thought and memory. Some women described feelings of unreality, as though floating outside themselves. Hunger, once a symbol of purity, became a quiet madness. They shivered even in warm rooms, wrapped in shawls while claiming to feel light and lovely. Their beauty had turned ghostly, their strength gone. Yet society continued to praise them for their restraint. There was no escape from the contradiction. Food meant smell, smell meant sin, and sin meant ruin. So they chose emptiness. Cups of tea replaced breakfast, scented water replaced lunch, and by evening they drifted through candlelit rooms like fragile ornaments of bone and silk. Husbands grew concerned, doctors puzzled, but none dared question the culture that demanded this performance. At night, their bodies trembled under lace covers, hearts slowed, hands went cold, and minds wandered between hunger and faint sleep. The world they had built, one of powders, perfumes, and silence had consumed them from the inside. It's strange to think that the same empire that conquered half the world was ruled in private by women too weak to climb a staircase without help. The pattern of denial persisted long after the Victorian age ended. Even in later decades, thinness and restraint remained ideals. The ghost of the fainting lady lingered, dressed in modern clothes, whispering that hunger still equalled beauty. The poisons had changed, but the sickness stayed. Hunger was not their only wound, but it was the one they inflicted upon themselves most willingly. They could endure filth, corsets, and sickness, but the fear of being seen as impure, of smelling human, was stronger than the need to live. In the end, their fragility became the truest symbol of the age beauty built upon exhaustion, grace purchased with breath and blood. They faded not from time but from self-denial, disappearing like their own reflections in the candlelight. And when history remembers their world of silk, lace, and powdered skin, it should also remember the silence of empty stomachs beneath it. Their stories remind us that the pursuit of perfection can rot the soul as easily as it once rotted the flesh. To understand Victorian women is to see both their beauty and their suffering, intertwined like the ribbons of a corset that never quite loosened. So tonight, as you let your own body rest and breathe freely, remember those who could not. They lived and died within the rules of their era, wrapped in the illusions of elegance, starved by the fear of being ordinary. Sleep softly, far from the perfumes, the corsets, and the hunger of that age. Good night.